9 years ago, my parents walked out of my milestone birthday celebration because my older sister faked a medical emergency. They expected me to pay the massive bill and quietly fade into the background like I always did. Instead, I paid the check, walked out of their lives, and spent the next decade building an empire they knew nothing about. I am Sloane, 35 years old, and until this morning, my pristine corner office in downtown Chicago was a sanctuary free from my toxic family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Sign the power of attorney, or I will have building security throw you out of your own firm. My mother, Catherine, shrieked as she slammed her $10,000 designer handbag onto my mahogany desk. The impact knocked over my iced latte, sending a wave of brown liquid spilling directly over a stack of highly confidential forensic audit files. I did not flinch. I slowly reached for a box of tissues, maintaining eye contact with the woman who had not bothered to call me in nearly a decade. "You are trespassing, Mother," I said carefully, dabbing the moisture away from the edge of the documents. "And building security works for me, considering my firm owns the top 3 floors of this high-rise." Brenda, my executive assistant, hovered nervously at the glass door, her hand resting on the panic button. I gave her a subtle shake of my head, silently signaling her to stand down. I wanted to hear exactly what kind of delusion had brought my family to my doorstep after all these years. A loud, mocking laugh echoed through the room. Terrence, my African-American brother-in-law, stepped out from behind my mother. He was wearing a bespoke suit, a silk tie, and an expression of pure, unadulterated arrogance. He had married my sister Penelope 10 years ago and was immediately gifted the chief operating officer position at my father's logistics company, despite having absolutely zero experience in supply chain management. "Do not play big shot with us, Sloane," Terrence sneered, pacing around my office as if he were evaluating the furniture for a garage sale. "We know you are just a glorified bookkeeper. Your father sent us to collect what belongs to the family." I tossed the soiled tissues into the wastebasket. A glorified bookkeeper. Is that what Penelope tells you between her fake panic attacks and staging photo shoots for social media? "Do not speak about your sister that way," Catherine snapped, her face turning an angry shade of red. "Penelope has severe anxiety. You are just bitter because she actually has a life, a successful husband, and you are sitting here entirely alone. You have always been jealous of her." I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, crossing my arms. Jealous, right. What exactly brings you to my office after 9 years of absolute silence? Did you run out of people to manipulate in Connecticut? Terrence stepped forward, placing both hands flat on my desk and leaning into my personal space. "Listen to me closely. The logistics company has a slight cash flow issue right now. We need the deed to the Aspen cabin your grandfather left you. It is a family asset and we need to leverage it for a commercial bridge loan today." I stared at his wrist. "A slight cash flow issue?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "You are wearing a solid gold luxury watch, Terrence. And Mother, that bag you just used to vandalize my workspace costs more than the college tuition you flatly refused to pay for me. Yet here you both are, barging into my business, begging for a property you haven't set foot in for over 10 years. Catherine slapped her hand on the desk again. "You ungrateful brat. We gave you life. We raised you. You owe this family your absolute loyalty. Penelope needs that property to build her new wellness retreat anyway. She deserves it after everything she has been through." I picked up a dry towel and wiped the last drop of coffee from my pen holder. "My grandfather left that cabin specifically to me, Mother. Do you know why? Because he knew if he left it to you or Dad, you would immediately sell it to fund Penelope's shopping habits or cover up whatever financial mess Terrence created this week." Terrence's jaw clenched. The facade of the polished executive slipped for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flash of genuine rage. He recovered quickly, adjusting his expensive cuffs. "We are not asking for a handout, Sloane. We are demanding family equity. Your father built his company from the ground up. I am running operations now and we are expanding rapidly. The bank just needs additional collateral to secure the new fleet of trucks." The Aspen cabin is sitting empty. You are going to sign the transfer right now, or my legal team will file an injunction against your little accounting business by noon. I looked around my spacious corner office, taking in the panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. My little accounting business. The sheer delusion it took to walk into a multi-million-dollar corporate auditing firm and call it a little business was astounding. But that was my family's specialty, absolute unwavering delusion. They only saw what they wanted to see. To them, I was still the invisible middle child, the scapegoat they could bully into submission whenever they needed a quick fix for their own catastrophic mistakes. You cannot file an injunction against my firm for a personal property dispute, Terrence, I stated calmly. You would know that if you actually went to business school instead of just marrying into a job title. Catherine gasped, clutching her chest in a dramatic gesture that perfectly mirrored her golden child daughter. How dare you speak to your brother-in-law that way? He is a high-level executive. He is out there making multi-million-dollar deals while you sit here playing with calculators. You have always been completely selfish, Sloane. Just like when you ruined Penelope's 30th birthday dinner by refusing to cover the bill after she was rushed to the emergency room. I felt a cold smile stretch across my face. She had indigestion from wearing a dress 2 sizes too small, Mother. And you all walked out leaving me alone at a Michelin star restaurant on my 26th birthday with a $4,000 tab. I paid it. And I never spoke to you again, until you barged in here today demanding I hand over a massive real estate asset to cover your mismanagement. We are not mismanaging anything, Terrence barked, his voice echoing off the glass walls. Your father's company is stronger than ever, but business requires liquidity, and you are hoarding a dead asset. Penelope is waiting down in the car right now, and she cannot handle the stress of your stubbornness. She is on the verge of a breakdown because of your selfishness. I am not signing anything, I said, locking eyes with him. You can take your empty threats and show yourselves out before I call security. Terrence reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a heavily folded legal document. He slammed it down on top of my audit files, smoothing out the creases with aggressive force. He reached into his other pocket, pulled out a heavy silver pen, and slid it across the polished wood of my desk until it hit my keyboard. He smirked, a chilling, calculating expression that made my skin crawl. Your father's company needs a bridge loan. You owe us for raising you. Sign it or we sue you for elder financial abuse. I stared at the heavy silver pen resting against my keyboard. I picked it up, feeling the cold metal between my fingers, and met Terrence's smug gaze. I let the pen drop. It hit the mahogany desk with a sharp clack that echoed in the silent office. Sue me for elder financial abuse. I repeated the words slowly, letting the sheer absurdity of the threat hang in the air. That is an interesting legal strategy, Terrence. Tell me, does your high-priced corporate counsel plan to mention the time this family deliberately stranded a 26-year-old at a Michelin-starred restaurant with a $4,000 tab? My mother scoffed loudly, crossing her arms over her chest. Are we really doing this again, Sloane? Are you seriously bringing up a dinner from 9 years ago when your sister is currently sitting in a car downstairs practically hyperventilating from the stress you are causing her? I stood up from my ergonomic chair and leaned across the desk. It was not just a dinner, Mother. It was supposed to be my milestone birthday celebration. But you and Dad decided it would be more cost-effective to combine it with Penelope's 30th. And isn't it fascinating how Penelope's mysterious heart palpitations flared up the exact second the waiter brought out the massive check? Catherine slammed her hands on the edge of my desk, her face twisting with rage. Your sister was having a legitimate medical emergency. She could not breathe. The paramedics said she was on the verge of a cardiac event, and you stood there complaining about a piece of paper. You are a cold, selfish monster who only cares about money. She did not have a cardiac event, I shot back, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. She had a panic attack because the waiter accidentally wished me a happy birthday first, and she could not stand sharing the spotlight for 30 seconds. The hospital discharged her an hour later with a prescription for antacids. Meanwhile, you and Dad hurried out behind her stretcher, leaving me alone at a table for 20. I sat there for 2 hours calling both of your phones while the restaurant manager hovered over my shoulder. I had to drain my entire emergency savings account to cover the cost of Penelope's vintage champagne and Terrence's imported Wagyu steaks. Terrence groaned, rolling his eyes dramatically. We did not come here for a therapy session about your childhood trauma, Sloane. We came for the deed. Your grandfather was senile when he left that Aspen cabin to you. Everyone knows it was meant for Penelope. Sign the transfer document now. I looked at the legal document Terrence had smoothed out over my audit files. I could see the sloppy legal drafting from a mile away. The spacing was off. The notary seal looked highly questionable. They were desperate bleeding cash and trying to patch a sinking corporate ship with a personal asset they had absolutely no legal right to touch. You want this deed so badly because Dad's logistics company is failing, I said, shifting my gaze between them. I read the industry reports. You lost 2 major shipping contracts last quarter, Terrence. A bridge loan will not save you. It will just delay the inevitable bankruptcy. Terrence's confident posture faltered. A flash of genuine panic crossed his face before he quickly masked it with aggressive posturing. You do not know anything about high-level logistics. We are expanding. We are acquiring new assets. The bank just needs a temporary collateral boost to finalize the paperwork. Now pick up the pen and sign it, or I swear to you I will make sure your professional reputation in the city is destroyed by tomorrow morning. My mother nodded vigorously in agreement. He will do it, Sloane. Do not test us. Your father is already furious that we even had to come down to this sterile little cubicle to beg you to do the right thing. You owe this family. We clothed you. We fed you. We allowed you to live under our roof. Allowed me to live under your roof. I chuckled softly, shaking my head at the boundless entitlement. You mean the roof where Penelope got the master suite remodel, while I slept in the drafty basement room next to the furnace? The roof where my college acceptance letters mysteriously went missing from the mail, because Penelope did not want me attending a better university than her. Stop acting like a victim, Catherine shrieked, her voice pitching high enough to make the glass walls of my office rattle. Penelope is out there building an empire as a lifestyle influencer. She has brand deals. She has millions of followers. All you have is a boring desk job and a bad attitude. Now give us the deed. I looked down at the document again. I traced the edge of the paper with my index finger, feigning hesitation. I knew exactly what I was going to do, but they needed to believe they were winning. They needed to feel that addictive rush of power they had thrived on my entire life. I am not signing this here, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Terrence slammed his fist on the desk. You will sign it right now, or we are going to court. I held up a hand, silencing him. I said I am not signing it here. I looked directly into my mother's furious eyes. Tomorrow is your and Dad's 40th wedding anniversary, isn't it? The massive gala at the Connecticut estate. 200 guests, catered dinner. The entire social elite will be there. Catherine narrowed her eyes, instantly suspicious. What does our anniversary have to do with this? If you want the deed to the Aspen cabin, you will invite me to the anniversary dinner tomorrow night, I stated clearly. I will bring the original property deed and the transfer paperwork. I will sign it there in person in front of the entire family. Terrence let out a loud, victorious bark of laughter. He looked at my mother and smirked. Unbelievable. She just wants an invitation to the big party. After all this grandstanding, she just wants a free plate of caviar and a chance to rub elbows with our wealthy friends. Catherine sighed, looking at me with pure disgust. You always were pathetic, Sloane. Begging for an invitation to a party you do not belong at. Fine. Wear something presentable. Do not embarrass us. And bring the deed. If you try to back out, your father will have his lawyers seize your business assets by Monday morning. I will be there, I promised, picking up the silver pen and handing it back to Terrence. 8 o'clock sharp. Terrence snatched the pen from my hand, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. Do not be late, bookkeeper. I watched them turn and walk out of my office. Catherine's heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor, and Terrence strutted beside her like a conquering king. They walked past my executive assistant without a single glance, entirely convinced they had just bullied me into handing over a multi-million-dollar property for the cheap price of a dinner invitation. Brenda stepped into the office as soon as the elevator doors closed behind them. She looked at the spilled coffee, then at me. Should I call building security to make sure they actually left the premises? No need, Brenda, I said, pulling a fresh stack of financial dossiers from my locked drawer. They are gone. But do me a favor and cancel my afternoon meetings. I need to finalize the corporate debt acquisition for tomorrow night. She nodded, a knowing smile playing on her lips. They have no idea what is coming, do they? I looked out the window at the sprawling city below. Not a clue. The next evening, the wrought iron gates of my parents' Connecticut estate swung open. The driveway was a sea of luxury vehicles, valet attendants rushing back and forth under the soft glow of gas lanterns. I handed over the keys to my understated sedan and walked up the marble steps. The heavy oak doors were propped open, leaking the sounds of a string quartet and the clinking of crystal glasses into the crisp night air. I adjusted the lapels of my tailored navy blazer, patted the leather portfolio tucked under my arm, and stepped inside the lion's den. The main foyer spilled into the grand ballroom, which was packed with New England socialites, corporate partners, and family friends who had spent the last 9 years pretending I did not exist. I had barely taken 10 steps past the coat check before the booming theatrical voice of my father echoed across the room. "Look who finally decided to show up," Richard bellowed. The music seemed to dip. Dozens of heads turned in my direction. My father marched toward me with a highball glass of scotch in one hand. He wore a custom tuxedo, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He did not offer a hug. He did not offer a handshake. Instead, he positioned himself so his wealthy friends could hear every word. "Still single, Sloane?" He asked, his voice dripping with faux pity. "Still pushing papers in a little cubicle somewhere? I told your mother it was a mistake to invite you. You always look so miserable at these events." But Terrence insisted. "Speaking of which, have you congratulated your brother-in-law yet? Terrence just closed a $5 million logistics deal for the company this morning. What have you accomplished this week?" A few of his golf buddies chuckled into their drinks. 9 years ago, that kind of public humiliation would have sent me running for the nearest exit with tears in my eyes. Tonight I just smiled. "I have accomplished quite a bit, Dad," I replied, my voice carrying effortlessly over the crowd. "And I am not pushing papers in a cubicle. I own my firm. As for Terrence's $5 million deal, I will be sure to congratulate him as soon as the ink is actually dry on those contracts. Assuming the funding clears, of course." My father's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Before he could formulate a response to my complete lack of intimidation, the crowd parted. Penelope made her grand entrance. She descended the sweeping curved staircase like she was accepting an Academy Award. She wore a floor-length emerald silk gown, and her neck and wrists were draped in diamond jewelry that easily cost more than a starter home. She floated over to my father, linking her arm through his, and looked me up and down with exaggerated disgust. Sloane, Penelope sighed, shaking her head. "A navy blazer to an anniversary gala. Really? Could you not afford to rent something appropriate? You look like you are about to sell us a life insurance policy. I could have lent you a dress if you were struggling that much." "I am very comfortable in what I own, Penelope," I said. "And considering why you dragged me here tonight, I figured business attire was the most appropriate choice." Catherine materialized from the crowd, flanking my sister like a bodyguard. Terrence was right behind her, his eyes immediately darting to the leather portfolio tucked under my arm. "Do not start a fight, Sloane," Catherine snapped. "Your sister has been under immense stress planning this party for us. Now give Terrence the paperwork. We have investors waiting in the study, and we need to wrap up this Aspen business before the bank closes on the West Coast." Penelope clapped her hands together, the diamonds catching the light. "Yes, give it here. Terrence and I have the most amazing vision for the Aspen cabin. I am turning it into an exclusive wellness retreat for my followers. We are going to knock down that ugly rustic frame and build glass meditation pods. It is going to be incredibly lucrative. You honestly should thank me for taking that dusty old shack off your hands." I looked at my sister, taking in the sheer audacity of her demands. "You want to demolish our grandfather's cabin so you can build meditation pods? It is called Vision Sloan, Terrence interjected, stepping uncomfortably close to me. Something you lack. Hand over the deed. We are wasting time. I tightened my grip on the portfolio. I told you I would bring the deed, Terrence. I never said I was going to hand it over the second I walked through the door. We are going to sit down like adults, review the terms of this transfer, and discuss exactly why the company is so desperate for my grandfather's property that you had to ambush my office yesterday. The air in the room grew thick. My father stepped forward, his face turning an angry shade of crimson. You do not dictate terms in my house, you arrogant girl. You will hand over that folder right now, or I will have you forcibly removed from this property. Try it. I challenged him, my tone deadpan. But if I walk out that door, the deed leaves with me and your bridge loan evaporates. I highly doubt your investors in the study will be thrilled to hear that you lost your only piece of viable collateral because you threw a temper tantrum in the middle of a gala. I watched the realization hit them. I was not the scared 26-year-old scapegoat anymore. I was holding the leash and they were completely cornered. Penelope's eyes darted frantically between me, her husband, and the wealthy guests who were openly staring at our family drama. She realized she was losing control of the narrative. Her demands were not working. Her insults were bouncing off me. She needed to regain the upper hand, and she only had one weapon left in her playbook. Suddenly, Penelope gasped loudly. She grabbed the diamond necklace at her throat as if it were choking her. Her eyes widened in manufactured terror. She stumbled backward, knocking over a tray of champagne flutes on a passing waiter. Crystals shattered across the marble floor. My heart. Penelope wheezed, her breathing becoming shallow and erratic. She clutched her chest with both hands. It is doing it again. The palpitations. Catherine screamed, rushing forward. Penelope! Give her space! Everyone give her space! Penelope swayed dramatically and collapsed perfectly into Terrence's waiting arms, making sure her emerald dress draped elegantly over his shoes. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my face. She is doing it again, Penelope cried out, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured cheeks. She is stressing me out on purpose. She wants to kill me. Make her stop. My heart. I cannot breathe. The grand ballroom devolved into instant pandemonium. The string quartet stopped playing mid-note, the abrupt silence replaced by the sound of wealthy socialites gasping in horror. Waiters froze in their tracks, trays of champagne hovering dangerously in the air. Penelope lay draped across the polished marble floor, her emerald gown fanned out around her like a tragic heroine in a cheap daytime soap opera. She clutched her chest with perfectly manicured fingers, taking loud, jagged gulps of air that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings. Terrence dropped to one knee beside her, playing the part of the devoted, terrified husband. He rubbed her shoulders, shouting for someone to get her some water. My mother. Catherine shoved her way through a cluster of shocked guests, her face pale with manufactured terror. She threw herself onto the floor next to Penelope, stroking my sister's hair and glaring up at me with absolute venom. You are killing your sister! Catherine screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. Look at what you are doing to her. Her heart cannot take this kind of abuse. Give Terrence the deed right now so she can calm down. I stood my ground, my hands resting lightly on the leather portfolio tucked under my arm. I looked down at the scene unfolding at my feet. It was a masterclass in manipulation, a routine Penelope had perfected over 3 decades. Any time the attention shifted away from her, any time she faced the word no, a sudden, mysterious medical emergency would conveniently strike. 9 years ago, it cost me my dignity and my savings. Tonight, it was just pathetic. Terrence sprang to his feet, abandoning his supposedly dying wife on the floor. He closed the distance between us in 2 long strides. He was a broad, imposing man, and he used every inch of his height to try and intimidate me. He stepped so close I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath and the nervous sweat radiating through his custom suit. Do not just stand there staring at her, Terrence barked, his face inches from mine. You caused this. You are stressing her out with your ridiculous stubbornness. Hand over the portfolio, Sloan. I will take the deed, we will get the transfer witnessed, and you can leave before you do any more damage to this family. He reached out his heavy hand, grabbing the edge of my leather portfolio. He tried to yank it away from me, assuming I would simply let go in the face of public pressure. He assumed the old Sloane was still in charge, the quiet girl who would do anything to avoid a scene. I locked my grip on the portfolio and stepped directly into his space, refusing to yield a single inch. "If you try to rip my personal property from my hands again, I will break your fingers," I stated, my voice low, steady, and entirely devoid of fear. Terrence froze. He blinked clearly, shocked by the icy authority in my tone. For a second, he looked at my father, who was standing behind the crowd, desperately trying to manage the whispers of the elite guests. Catherine wailed again, her cries growing louder as she cradled Penelope. "Richard, do something. Call an ambulance. Tell Sloane to sign the papers. Penelope's chest is tight. She is having a heart attack." I sighed, stepping around Terrence's massive frame. I walked calmly toward my mother and sister. The crowd of onlookers stepped back, giving me a wide berth. They expected me to drop to my knees and apologize. They expected me to surrender the deed to save my sister's life. Instead, I crouched down next to Penelope. Her eyes were squeezed shut, her lips parted as she performed a series of dramatic shallow pants. Her diamond-encrusted Apple Watch gleamed under the chandelier light strapped tightly to her left wrist. Without a word, I reached out and grabbed her wrist. Penelope's eyes snapped open in sheer panic. She tried to yank her arm away, letting out a sharp squeal of protest. "What are you doing? Get away from me!" My heart. "Hold still, Penelope," I commanded, my grip like a vice. "You are having a medical emergency. We need to check your vitals." I tapped the screen of her smartwatch. The biometric display lit up immediately, tracking the data it had been silently recording all evening. I did not just look at it. I read the numbers aloud, projecting my voice, so every single wealthy socialite, corporate partner, and family friend in the ballroom could hear me with crystal clarity. "Heart rate is 72 beats per minute," I announced. "Blood oxygen level is 99%. I dropped her wrist. It hit the marble floor with a soft thud. I stood up, smoothing the front of my navy blazer, and looked down at my sister. For someone allegedly having a massive cardiac event, you have the resting vitals of a sleeping toddler. A collective stunned silence fell over the grand ballroom. The guests stared, their mouths slightly agape. The hushed whispers completely ceased. You could hear a pin drop. The realization washed over the crowd in real time. There was no medical emergency. There was no heart attack. It was a temper tantrum thrown by a 39-year-old woman wearing millions of dollars in diamonds. Penelope's face flushed a deep mottled red. The fake gasping stopped instantly. The illusion was shattered, completely obliterated by hard data. Furious and humiliated, she scrambled to her feet, smoothing down her emerald gown. She glared at me, her chest heaving, but this time with genuine, unadulterated rage. Catherine scrambled up beside her, looking frantically at the guests, trying to salvage the situation. "The watch must be broken," Catherine stammered. "It is a faulty reading. Nobody bought it. The damage was done." Terrence, realizing his wife had just been exposed as a manipulative fraud and his chance at securing the deed was slipping away, lost whatever remaining composure he had. He stormed toward me, his fists clenched at his sides. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, spit flying from his lips as he shouted, "You have no right to touch my wife. You have no right to come into this house and humiliate her. You think you are so smart with your little numbers and your portfolio? You are nothing. You are just a jealous, broke accountant who cannot stand the fact that we are actually successful." I did not back away. I looked at his shaking finger, then up at his enraged, sweating face. A slow, chilling smile spread across my lips. "I am an accountant, Terrence." I agreed, my voice echoing through the silent room. "Which is exactly why I audited your $5 million logistics deal." The color drained from Terrence's face so fast, he looked physically ill. The aggressive jut of his jaw dissolved into a slack-jawed stare. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. I did not give him the chance to recover or spin another lie. I turned my back on him and walked purposefully toward the massive media wall at the far end of the ballroom. A custom 80-inch smart TV was currently looping a sickeningly sweet slideshow of my parents over the last 40 years. Photos of them toasting on yachts, smiling on ski slopes, and posing with Penelope filled the screen. I was conspicuously absent from every single frame. It was the perfect canvas for my presentation. I pulled my sleek tablet from my leather portfolio and tapped the screen mirroring icon. The giant television blinked. The image of my parents clinking champagne flutes in Paris vanished, replaced instantly by a stark, high-resolution spreadsheet titled Internal Audit Summary. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of socialites and business partners. The polite clinking of crystal glasses ceased entirely. My father marched forward, his face flushed with a dangerous mix of confusion and fury. "What do you think you are doing, Sloane?" Richard demanded, waving his scotch glass at the screen. "Turn that off immediately. This is an anniversary party, not a boardroom. You are embarrassing your mother in front of our guests." "You wanted to talk about business, Dad," I replied, my voice projecting clearly across the silent room. "You wanted to mock my career and praise Terrence for closing a massive logistics deal. I think your investors who are standing right here in this room might want to see exactly what kind of deals your chief operating officer is closing." I tapped my tablet. The spreadsheet on the massive screen shifted to a series of highly detailed bank wire transfers. Red arrows highlighted massive sums of cash leaving my father's corporate accounts. "This is your $5 million deal," I announced, stepping to the side so everyone had a clear view. Terrence claimed he secured a massive supply chain contract with a new overseas vendor. He presented you with forged projections, fake invoices, and a fabricated corporate profile. And because you trust him blindly, you gave him authorization to release the funds without a secondary review. Terrence lunged forward, his face gleaming with a sudden heavy layer of sweat. "Turn it off!" he screamed, his voice cracking in panic. He shoved past a waiter, nearly knocking him over. "She is lying. These documents are forged. This is corporate espionage. Richard, call security. She hacked my computer." I swiped to the next slide, ignoring his frantic outburst. "I did not hack anything, Terrence. Your sloppy accounting left a paper trail a mile long. You routed those funds through 3 separate shell companies. You thought creating dummy invoices for non-existent shipping crates would hide the cash flow deficit, but you forgot to scrub the routing numbers from the origin bank." I pointed to the screen where 3 distinct company names appeared, all highlighted in bright, undeniable yellow. Apex Global Solutions, Vertex Holdings, and Summit Logistics. All 3 limited liability companies were registered in Delaware less than 6 months ago, the exact time the cash flow issues at Dad's company began. Richard stopped walking. His polished leather shoes squeaked to a halt on the marble floor. He stared at the screen, his scotch glass trembling slightly in his grip. The anger in his eyes was rapidly being replaced by a terrifying hollow dread. He was a seasoned businessman. He knew exactly what a shell company looked like. He knew exactly what a bleeding balance sheet meant. I could see the prominent investors in the room exchanging alarmed, furious glances. "Those are vendors," Terrence shouted, his voice echoing shrilly over the whispers of the crowd. "They are legitimate vendors. We are acquiring new fleets." "You have no idea how corporate expansion works, you glorified bookkeeper. You are just trying to ruin my reputation because your own life is a miserable failure." Catherine rushed to Terrence's side, grabbing his arm protectively. She pointed a manicured finger at me. "How dare you accuse him of this, Sloane? He is family. He is saving your father's business while you sit around looking for ways to ruin us. You are doing this because you are jealous of Penelope." Penelope, having magically recovered from her near-death experience, strutted forward. Her emerald dress swished around her ankles. "You are deranged, Sloane. Terrence works 80-hour weeks for this family. You are just furious that Dad trusts him more than you." "He is not saving the business, Mother," I stated flatly, ignoring my sister completely. "He is bleeding it dry. And Dad trusts him because Dad wanted a son, not an accountant daughter who actually knows how to read a financial statement." I tapped my screen one last time. The image on the television zoomed in on the corporate registration documents for the 3 Delaware LLCs. The text magnified until the fine print was impossible for anyone in the room to miss. The room felt as though all the oxygen had been sucked out of it. I looked at Terrence. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving under his bespoke suit. His eyes darted wildly toward the heavy oak doors, calculating his chances of making a run for it. "If these are legitimate vendors, Terrence," I said, letting my voice drop to a lethal calm, "why are all three LLCs registered under the name Beatrice Vance?" The ballroom went dead silent. The silence was absolute, heavy, and crushing. Beatrice Vance was Terrence's mother's maiden name. "You did not close a $5 million deal," I continued, locking eyes with my father, before turning my relentless gaze back to my sweating, terrified brother-in-law. "You embezzled $4.2 million. The absolute silence in the ballroom lasted exactly 3 seconds before Penelope shattered it. I expected her to turn on Terrence. I expected her to scream at the man she married, the man who had just been exposed for stealing millions of dollars from her own father to fund his lavish lifestyle. Any rational person would have demanded an explanation from the criminal standing right next to them. But Penelope was not rational. She was the golden child, and in her warped reality, the person holding the mirror was always the one to blame for the ugly reflection. Penelope whirled around, her emerald silk gown whipping violently around her ankles. She did not look at Terrence. She looked at me, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged hysteria. Tears began to stream down her cheeks, ruining her pristine makeup. "How could you do this to my husband?" Penelope shrieked, pointing an accusing diamond-clad finger right at my face. "You are just trying to ruin my marriage because nobody wants you." I stared at her, genuinely astounded by the sheer magnitude of her delusion. "He stole $4 million from Dad, Penelope. The bank records are literally projected on a 30-foot screen right behind you. The money he uses to buy you those diamonds was siphoned out of our father's retirement accounts." "I do not care about your stupid spreadsheets," she sobbed, stomping her foot on the marble floor like a petulant toddler. "You have always been jealous of me. You have always hated Terrence because he is successful and charming, and you are just a miserable, lonely spinster. You fabricated all of this just to embarrass me in front of our friends." The guests were openly staring now. Some were whispering behind their hands, while others were slowly inching toward the exit, desperate to escape the fallout. Terrence stood completely paralyzed. The arrogant, posturing executive who had threatened me in my office just 24 hours ago had completely vanished. He hid behind his crying wife, letting her fight his battles. Catherine stepped directly into my line of sight, physically shielding Terrence and Penelope from my gaze. Her eyes were wild, darting frantically around the room as she realized the social elite of Connecticut were watching her perfect family implode. She needed a narrative, and she needed it instantly. "It is a legal tax loophole," Catherine announced, loudly projecting her voice so the nearest investors could hear her. She grabbed Terrence by the arm, gripping his jacket sleeve. "Terrence is an innovator. He was simply restructuring the corporate assets to minimize our tax burden. It is advanced financial strategy." I let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "Embezzling corporate funds into Delaware shell companies registered under your mother-in-law's maiden name is not a tax loophole, Mother. It is a federal crime. It is wire fraud, grand larceny, and corporate malfeasance. The FBI does not consider that an advanced strategy. They consider it a felony." Catherine's face flushed a deep, violent red. She marched up to me, stepping so close I could smell the sharp tang of her expensive perfume. She lowered her voice to a harsh, venomous whisper. "You listen to me, Sloan. You are going to fix this. You are an accountant. You know how to move numbers around. You are going to go into the system tonight, and you are going to reclassify those transfers as legitimate corporate expenses. You will bury this. You will protect your brother-in-law, and you will protect the family name." "You want me to commit accounting fraud to cover up his theft?" I asked, making sure my voice carried clearly to the surrounding crowd. "You want me to risk my professional license and my freedom so Terrence can keep buying luxury sports cars with Dad's money?" "He is family," Catherine hissed, her composure totally fracturing. "Family protects family. You owe us, Sloan. We gave you everything." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked her dead in the eye. "I owe you nothing." Catherine lost her mind. She slapped the surface of the nearby cocktail table so hard the empty champagne glasses rattled against the wood. "We paid for your college!" she screamed, completely abandoning her high society persona. "We clothed you. We funded your entire life. You owe this family your loyalty." The lie echoed in the grand ballroom. It was the same lie she had told her country club friends for years. The story of the generous, supportive parents who had graciously funded their youngest daughter's education, only for that daughter to become distant and ungrateful. For a decade, I had swallowed that lie to keep the peace. I had bitten my tongue while they took credit for my survival. Not tonight. I reached into my leather portfolio. I bypassed the audit files and the Aspen cabin deed. I pulled out a thick, folded stack of papers held together by a heavy binder clip. It was a certified bank statement stamped and verified. I unfolded it slowly, deliberately, and held it up right in front of my mother's face. "You didn't pay a dime," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like glass. "I paid off my $80,000 student loans working night shifts." Catherine blinked, staring at the certified document. The bold red stamp indicating a zero balance stared back at her. "You told everyone you paid my tuition," I continued, my voice rising, so the entire room could hear the absolute truth. "But the day the tuition bill arrived, you told me I had to figure it out because Penelope needed a European graduation trip to find herself. I worked graveyard shifts at a diner while taking 18 credit hours a semester. I lived on instant noodles in a studio apartment with no heat while you bought Terrence a solid gold watch for his birthday. You never gave me a single penny. I built my firm, my wealth, and my life entirely on my own." Penelope sniffled loudly, trying to reclaim the victim narrative. "Why are you bringing up college? You are just trying to deflect because you are a terrible sister." I turned my gaze away from my mother and looked directly at my father, who was still staring in horror at the massive television screen displaying his looted bank accounts. "I paid my own way," I repeated, tossing the bank statements onto the cocktail table. "But speaking of debts, let us move on to the real reason you invited me here tonight." I locked eyes with my father. The bluster had completely drained from his posture. He looked exactly like what he was, an aging man whose empire was crumbling beneath his Italian leather shoes. The grand ballroom, with its crystal chandeliers and imported floral arrangements, suddenly felt like a beautifully decorated courtroom, and I was the prosecution. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and sudden, sharp fear. Waiters stood frozen against the walls, holding trays of hors d'oeuvres that no one would ever eat. "You thought you could summon me to this anniversary masquerade and bully me into signing over the Aspen cabin," I said, my voice carrying effortlessly across the silent ballroom. "You sent Penelope to play the loving sister. You sent Catherine to play the stern matriarch. You let Terrence threaten me with physical intimidation. All of it was a desperate, uncoordinated scramble to secure the only unencumbered asset this family has left." Penelope wiped her ruined mascara, her face twisting into an ugly sneer. She stamped her foot, the heel of her designer shoe, cracking sharply against the marble floor. "It is a family property. We wanted to build a wellness retreat. You are just spinning wild conspiracies to make yourself look important and destroy my special night." I did not even look at her. "A wellness retreat," I scoffed, keeping my gaze fixed on my father. "A beautiful lie for the country club set. But numbers do not care about your social standing, Dad. Numbers do not care about your carefully curated public image. Numbers only tell the absolute truth." I picked up my tablet from the cocktail table. With a quick swipe of my finger, the spreadsheet detailing Terrence's embezzlement vanished from the massive media screen. It was instantly replaced by a stark, heavily redacted legal document bearing the seal of the largest commercial bank in the state. The bold red letters across the top read "Notice of Default and Intent to Foreclose." A fresh wave of gasps erupted from the crowd. The corporate partners and wealthy investors who had been sipping champagne only minutes ago were now staring at the screen in absolute horror. Whispers broke out like wildfire. The facade of the great Richard Vance was being dismantled brick by brick in front of his most important peers. People who had invested millions alongside him were physically backing away, putting distance between themselves and the sinking ship. Your company is bleeding cash, I announced, walking slowly back toward the center of the room. My low heels clicked rhythmically on the polished floor. Terrence siphoning off $4.2 million was just the fatal blow to an already doomed enterprise. You have been wildly overleveraged for years. You took out a massive corporate loan to cover operational deficits, and you used the primary estate as collateral. 3 weeks ago, you missed the final grace period payment. The bank officially initiated foreclosure proceedings. Catherine gasped, her hand flying to her throat. She looked at Richard, her eyes wide with genuine panic. The wealthy socialite who had just seconds ago demanded my absolute loyalty was now realizing her designer world was evaporating into thin air. The parties, the galas, the endless stream of luxury, all of it was built on borrowed time and borrowed money. Richard, Catherine whispered, her voice trembling, stripping away decades of practiced elegance. Is this true? Tell them she is lying. Tell them we are fine. Richard did not look at his wife. He glared at me with a hatred so pure it practically vibrated in the air. He straightened his spine, attempting to summon the commanding presence that had built his company decades ago. He adjusted his silk tie and jutted his chin forward, refusing to surrender his pride, even as the walls caved in around him. You are overstepping your bounds, Sloane, Richard boomed, trying to project authority to the fleeing investors. You come in here with stolen documents and half-truths thinking you understand high-level corporate finance. This is a temporary liquidity issue caused by normal market fluctuations. Every major corporation faces these hurdles. Market fluctuations do not forge invoices and route cash to Delaware shell companies. I countered smoothly, never raising my voice. Terrence stole your liquidity. And your utter lack of oversight, your refusal to look at your own ledgers, allowed it to happen right under your nose. The situation is completely under control. Richard insisted, his face turning a dangerous shade of red as he tried to drown out the whispers of his peers. He pointed a rigid, shaking finger at me. My lawyers are restructuring that debt with the bank as we speak. We are finalizing favorable terms that will secure the estate and the company. You know nothing, you arrogant girl. You are just a bitter accountant playing dress-up in a world you do not comprehend. I stopped pacing. I stood perfectly still in the center of the grand ballroom, surrounded by the wreckage of my family's pride. I looked at Terrence, who was sweating through his custom suit and inching toward the service exit. I looked at Penelope, whose mouth was hanging open in stunned, uncomprehending silence. I looked at Catherine, who was clutching her pearl necklace like a lifeline. Finally, I looked at my father. A slow, icy smirk spread across my face. It was the smile of a woman who had spent 9 grueling years preparing for exactly this moment, building an empire in the shadows while they paraded in the spotlight. Your lawyers were restructuring it. I corrected my tone, dropping to a dangerous silken whisper that commanded the attention of every single person in the room. They spent the last 2 weeks begging the bank for an extension. They pleaded for new terms. They tried to leverage the Aspen cabin as collateral, which is exactly why you needed my signature tonight so desperately. You needed my property to save your own skin. Richard crossed his arms over his chest, his knuckles white. And they succeeded. The bank agreed to a meeting. I agreed, nodding slowly. But the bank no longer holds your note. Richard froze. His arms dropped slowly to his sides. The false bravado melted away, leaving only the terrified core of a ruined man. What are you talking about? Banks do not like toxic debt, Dad, I explained, relishing every single syllable, delivering the final blow with surgical precision. They especially do not like toxic debt attached to companies actively being embezzled by their own chief operating officers. When a debt becomes too risky, banks sell it off to clear their ledgers. They sell it to private equity firms, willing to take on the risk for a steep premium. I tapped my tablet one final time. The notice of default on the massive screen was replaced by a transfer of ownership document. The buyer was listed as Vanguard Financial Holdings. An independent private equity firm bought your toxic debt at an aggressive premium at 9 o'clock this morning. I stated, my voice echoing through the silent ballroom. Your lawyers are not negotiating with the bank anymore. The bank washed their hands of you. Richard stared at the screen, his face turning the color of wet ash. Vanguard Financial, he muttered, reading the name on the document as if it were written in a foreign language. He looked back at me, his eyes wide with a sudden terrifying realization. Who is Vanguard Financial? I smoothed the front of my navy blazer and lifted my chin. I looked down at the man who had dismissed me, belittled me, and cast me aside for my entire life. I own that equity firm, Dad. I said, the words landing like physical blows in the quiet room. I bought your toxic debt. I hold the note on your estate, your corporate accounts, and your remaining assets. I am your biggest creditor. The collective gasp from the remaining guests sounded like all the air being sucked out of a vacuum. The absolute shock paralyzed the room for exactly 2 seconds before the panic set in. These were the elites of Connecticut. They were people whose entire existence was predicated on wealth status and avoiding the stench of failure at all costs. Bankruptcy was a contagion, and embezzlement was a fatal disease. Nobody wanted to be caught standing on the deck of a sinking ship. The exodus began instantly. The hushed whispers turned into frantic, urgent murmurs as socialites and corporate investors turned their backs on my father. Women in designer gowns grabbed their husbands by the arms, steering them toward the grand double doors. Men who had just been toasting Richard Vance's business acumen were now avoiding his gaze, practically sprinting for the valet stand. Waiters, sensing the catastrophic shift in the atmosphere, abandoned their silver trays of hors d'oeuvres on nearby tables and vanished into the service corridors. Within minutes, the opulent ballroom transformed from a celebration of my family's legacy into a ghost town of abandoned champagne flutes and shattered reputations. Richard watched his empire walk out the door, the color drained from his face, replaced by a mottled, furious red. The polished, aristocratic patriarch disappeared, leaving behind a cornered, desperate man who was losing everything he had ever valued. He whipped his head around his eyes, locking onto me with a terrifying intensity. He closed the distance between us in 3 long, aggressive strides. He did not care that a few lingering guests were still watching. He did not care about optics anymore. He stepped directly into my personal space, towering over me, using every inch of his height and broad frame to try and physically intimidate me. He breathed heavily, the sharp scent of expensive scotch and nervous sweat radiating off him. He pointed his finger so close to my face I could feel the air move. "You will cancel this note immediately!" Richard ordered, his voice a low, guttural growl, vibrating with rage. "You will call your people at Vanguard Financial right now, and you will dissolve this debt. You are a Vance. You are my daughter. You have a family duty to protect this company and this estate, and you will not disrespect me in my own home." Terence hovered a few feet behind him, nodding frantically, eager to hide behind my father's authority. Penelope was clutching her emerald gown, her chest heaving as she waited for me to crumble. They all expected the old Sloane to return. They expected the quiet, obedient girl, who always backed down when Richard raised his voice, the girl who would sacrifice her own well-being to maintain the family peace. I did not back away. I did not lower my gaze. I locked my eyes onto his, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my expression entirely unreadable. I looked at the finger pointing in my face, and then I looked back into his furious eyes. "Family duty is a two-way street, Dad," I stated, my voice echoing with icy precision through the nearly empty ballroom. "You forfeited my loyalty the day you let Terence bleed your company dry while calling me a failure. You forfeited my loyalty when you funded Penelope's lavish lifestyle while telling me to take out loans I had to pay back by working graveyard shifts. I am not your obedient little girl anymore. I am your master creditor." Richard's jaw clenched. He took another step forward, trying to force me to retreat. I stood my ground, my feet planted firmly on the marble floor. "You have 48 hours, I declared, slicing through his intimidation tactics with absolute authority. "You have exactly 48 hours to pay the $4.2 million that Terence stole. If that money is not wired into the Vanguard holding account by the deadline, I will initiate the next phase of the process. I am foreclosing on this mansion. I am freezing every single one of your corporate assets. and I will liquidate your company piece by piece to satisfy the debt." The words hung in the air, heavy and lethal. Richard staggered backward, as if I had physically struck him. The reality of the deadline crashed over him. He was completely out of options, out of leverage, and out of time. Catherine, who had been standing paralyzed near the abandoned media screen, suddenly snapped out of her shock. The threat of losing her opulent mansion, her status, and her entire identity was too much for her fragile reality to handle. She lunged forward, her high heels clicking frantically against the marble floor. Her perfectly coiffed hair was beginning to unravel, matching her declining sanity. "You can't do this!" Catherine screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill, desperate shriek that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. "We will not let you take our home. We still have the Aspen property." She turned to Richard, grabbing his arm and shaking it as if trying to wake him up. "Tell her, Richard. Tell her we have the cabin. It is worth millions. We can sell it. We can cover the stolen money and save the estate." Penelope, sensing a lifeline, immediately joined the chorus. Her tears stopped, instantly replaced by a vicious, entitled glare. "That is right," Penelope yelled, marching up to stand beside our mother. "We have Aspen. And you are not getting your hands on it, Sloane. That cabin is going to save us. It is my inheritance anyway. I am the rightful heir to it, and you cannot touch it." They stood shoulder to shoulder, a united front of delusion. They clung to the mountain cabin as their final unbreakable shield against the ruin I had just laid at their feet. They actually believed they still had a way out. They believed the safety net was still firmly in place. I looked at my mother's frantic face. I looked at Penelope's arrogant sneer. I looked at my father, who was suddenly clinging to the mention of the Aspen real estate with a pathetic, desperate hope. I let out a slow, quiet sigh. I reached back into my leather portfolio, my fingers brushing against the heavy notarized document I had been waiting all night to reveal. I slowly shook my head, setting up the final devastating domino. I slowly shook my head, setting up the final devastating domino. Catherine interpreted my silence as weakness. She took a bold step forward, her chin tipped up in a posture of desperate manufactured supremacy. She smoothed the front of her ruined silk dress and adopted the sharp, condescending tone she had used to belittle me since childhood. "You are not keeping that cabin, Sloane," Catherine commanded, pointing a rigid finger at my chest. "That property belongs to your sister, and you know it. The only reason your name is on that deed is due to a clerical error at the county clerk's office. Your grandfather was heavily medicated in his final weeks. The paralegal drafted the transfer documents incorrectly, and you took advantage of a dying man's confusion." I raised an eyebrow, letting her spin her web of lies in front of the remaining guests, who were hovering near the ballroom exits, unable to tear themselves away from the spectacle. "A clerical error," I repeated, keeping my tone perfectly flat. "Exactly," Catherine snapped, emboldened by my calm demeanor. "And if you do not hand over the deed tonight to satisfy this ridiculous Vanguard debt, we will sue you for a title correction. We have the best estate lawyers in the state on retainer. We will drag you through probate court for years until you are bankrupt. We will prove that Arthur intended for his firstborn granddaughter to inherit the Aspen estate. It is her birthright." Penelope eagerly jumped on the bandwagon, her fake tears instantly drying up. She crossed her arms, looking at me with absolute, unfiltered contempt. "Grandpa Arthur loved me best," Penelope declared, her voice echoing shrilly across the marble floor. "I was his favorite. Everyone knew it. You were just the quiet little shadow sitting in the corner while I actually spent time with him. You manipulated him at the end, Sloane. You slithered in when he was weak and tricked him into signing that paper. It is disgusting. You are a fraud, and I am taking my cabin back." The sheer audacity of their delusion was almost breathtaking. They had convinced themselves of their own lies so thoroughly that reality was no longer a factor in their universe. They believed their status and their volume could simply overwrite legal facts. I did not argue with them. I did not raise my voice or defend my relationship with my grandfather. There was no need. I reached inside the interior pocket of my tailored navy blazer and retrieved a weathered, cream-colored envelope. The room watched in absolute silence as I broke the old wax seal. I slid out a piece of heavy parchment paper, unfolded it carefully, and held it up. The paper was covered in sharp, spidery cursive. At the very bottom, next to a bold signature, was the raised, embossed stamp of a state notary public. "This is not a clerical error, Mother," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy air. "And it is not a misunderstanding. This is a legally binding, notarized addendum to Grandpa Arthur's final will, executed and filed exactly 3 days before he passed away. He gave me a copy, and he gave the original to the estate executor." Richard finally found his voice, stepping out from behind Catherine. He looked at the heavy parchment in my hands with a mixture of suspicion and dread. "What is that Arthur never mentioned an addendum? He told me his affairs were in order." "He did not tell you because you were the reason he had to write it," I replied, locking eyes with my father. "He wanted to make sure his final wishes were explicitly clear in his own words, so that none of you could ever contest the transfer of the Aspen property." I looked down at the letter. The familiar handwriting brought a sudden sharp ache to my chest, but I pushed the grief aside. This was about justice. I cleared my throat and began to read aloud, ensuring my voice reached every corner of the vast, silent ballroom. "To whom it may concern, and specifically to my son Richard," I read, my voice steady and unwavering. "I am of sound mind and clear conscience as I dictate these final terms. I hereby leave the entirety of the Aspen property, including the land and the cabin, solely and irrevocably to my granddaughter Sloane Vance." Catherine scoffed loudly, waving her hand. "We know what the deed says. That proves nothing about his state of mind." I ignored her and continued reading, moving to the second paragraph, delivering the words like a judge reading a final sentence. "I am making this explicit transfer because I can no longer trust my own family." I read, watching the color drain from my father's face. "6 weeks ago, I caught Penelope stealing from my private study. I watched her take 3 of my antique Patek Philippe watches, heirlooms I intended to pass down to future generations. When I confronted her, she lied to my face." Penelope let out a sharp, strangled gasp. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute terror, as the guests standing near the doors began to murmur in shock. The whispers grew louder. Patek Philippe watches were worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The socialites who had fawned over Penelope all evening were now staring at her as if she were a common criminal. I continued reading mercilessly. Worse still, I brought this theft to Richard's attention. I asked my son to discipline his daughter and return the stolen property. Instead, Richard turned a blind eye. He made excuses for her behavior, claiming she was just borrowing them, and refused to hold her accountable. He chose to protect a thief to preserve his perfect family image, prioritizing his pride over my trust. Richard staggered backward, as if he had been struck. The remaining corporate investors, the men who trusted him with millions of dollars, were staring at him with open disgust. A man who would cover up his own daughter stealing from a dying grandfather could never be trusted in a boardroom. His reputation, the only thing he truly cared about, was disintegrating into dust before his eyes. I read the final lines of the letter, letting my grandfather's final judgment echo through the room. "I leave the Aspen property to Sloane because she is the only one in this family who possesses an ounce of integrity. She has never asked me for a dime, yet she is the only one who sits by my bed. This cabin is her sanctuary. It is her escape from this den of vipers. May she use it to build a life far away from the corruption of her parents and her sister." Signed, Arthur Vance. I carefully folded the parchment and slipped it back into my blazer pocket. I looked up at my family. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of Penelope's frantic, hyperventilating breaths. Penelope's perfect, carefully constructed socialite image was entirely shattered. The woman who had just minutes ago claimed to be the beloved golden child was now exposed as a thief who robbed her own dying grandfather. She looked around at the staring guests, her face twisting into a mask of pure horror. She let out a high, piercing shriek, covering her face with her hands, as the humiliation finally broke her completely. "You needed Aspen to save yourselves," I said, looking at my devastated parents and my sobbing sister. "But Grandpa knew exactly who you were, and he made sure you would never get your hands on it." I turned to my father, who was staring at the floor, a broken, defeated man. "You have 48 hours to pay the Vanguard debt, Dad," I reminded him, my tone offering zero mercy. or I take everything else. The silence that followed my ultimatum was absolute. Richard stared at the marble floor, his shoulders slumped, the fight completely drained from his aging frame. Catherine was weeping silently into her hands, mourning the imminent death of her country club supremacy. But Penelope did not weep. The initial shock of being exposed as a common thief had passed, and the suffocating weight of public humiliation ignited something dark and volatile inside her. The sweet, perfectly curated facade of the Vance family golden child cracked, splintered, and then violently exploded. Penelope dragged her hands down her face, smearing her expensive makeup into jagged dark streaks. When she looked up at me, her eyes were wide, manic, and burning with a feral, unhinged hatred. She let out a sound that was half laugh and half snarl. "You think you are so brilliant," Penelope sneered, her voice dropping the melodic pitch she had practiced for decades and adopting a harsh, grating edge. "You stand there in your cheap corporate suit acting like you have finally won. You think buying some toxic debt makes you better than me? You will never be better than me, Sloane. You have always been the pathetic, boring shadow trailing behind my spotlight." I kept my expression entirely neutral. I did not flinch. I let her dig her own grave in front of the remaining guests who were watching the breakdown with morbid fascination. "I am the one everyone loves," Penelope shouted, gesturing wildly around the grand ballroom. "I am the beautiful one. I am the one who deserves the Aspen estate. Grandpa was a senile old fool at the end, and you manipulated his dementia. But it does not matter. You have always been a joke. You have always been desperate for attention." She took a step closer to me, her chest heaving. A cruel, triumphant smile twisted her lips. She wanted to hurt me. She needed to draw blood to feel powerful again. "Do you remember your 26th birthday?" Penelope asked, her voice dripping with venom. "You had just gotten that massive promotion at your first financial firm. You were so ridiculously proud of yourself. You invited all the senior partners, all your little corporate friends, thinking you had finally made it. I remembered it perfectly. It was the night my carefully planned celebration turned into a spectacular disaster. The venue canceled my reservation hours before the event, claiming a sudden double booking. The catering company never arrived. My colleagues stood on the sidewalk while I scrambled to salvage the night, humiliated and panicked." Penelope threw her head back and laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. "I paid the venue manager $5,000 to cancel your reservation," Penelope confessed, her eyes gleaming with malice. "I called the caterers and pretended to be you, screaming at them until they refused to serve the event. You were getting too big for your boots, Sloane. You were taking up too much oxygen. I could not stand the thought of you being the center of attention, parading around like you were special. You needed to be put back in your place." A murmur of absolute disgust rippled through the remaining crowd. Even Catherine lowered her hands, staring at her favorite daughter in shock. But Penelope was too far gone to care about the audience. She was feeding on her own cruelty, intoxicated by the venom she was finally letting loose. "And it was not just your stupid birthday party," Penelope taunted, taking another aggressive step toward me. "You always wondered why you were so unlucky in love, right? Why David suddenly stopped calling you back? Why Marcus broke up with you out of nowhere right before the holidays?" My stomach tightened, but I kept my face frozen in a mask of polite indifference. "I ruined them for you," Penelope bragged, jabbing a finger in my direction. "I tracked David down at his gym. I told him you had a history of severe psychiatric breakdowns and that you were secretly engaged to someone else. I took Marcus out for drinks and cried to him, making up vicious rumors about how you were just using him for his professional connections. I planted the seeds and I watched them run away from you." She crossed her arms, her chin jutting forward in a stance of absolute defiance. "I wanted you to be alone, Sloane. I wanted you to be miserable. Because no matter what you achieved at work, you needed to know that you were unlovable. You needed to know that I held the power to destroy your happiness with a single conversation. You are nothing but an ugly, unwanted stray in this family." The sheer magnitude of her sociopathy hung in the air. For years, I had blamed my own flaws for my failed relationships and ruined milestones. I had internalized every rejection. Hearing the truth now did not break me. It liberated me. It proved that my only flaw was being related to a monster. I looked at Penelope with pure, unadulterated pity. You dedicated your entire life to sabotaging mine because you had nothing of your own to build, I stated calmly. You are a hollow, empty shell, Penelope. And now you do not even have Grandpa's watches or his cabin to fill the void. Penelope opened her mouth to scream another insult, but she never got the chance. Terrence moved so fast he was practically a blur. He shoved past Richard and grabbed Penelope tightly by the upper arm, yanking her around to face him. His face was purple with rage, the veins in his neck bulging against his stiff collar. The quiet, compliant husband act evaporated instantly. "Shut up," Terrence roared, his voice booming with a raw, terrifying fury that made Penelope flinch. He shook her arm, ignoring her squeak of pain. Terrence was staring down the barrel of a $4.2 million embezzlement charge. He had banked his entire survival on Richard Vance bailing him out, and when that failed, he had silently banked on liquidating Penelope's supposed inheritance in Aspen. Now standing in the wreckage of the Vance empire, he realized he had shackled himself to a penniless, toxic liability. "You told me that Aspen house was yours when we got married." Terrence screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "You swore to me the deed was in a trust with your name on it. You told me it was an untouchable asset." Terrence let go of me. Penelope whined suddenly, trying to shrink back into the victim role, casting nervous glances at the remaining guests. "You are hurting my arm. We can figure this out." Figure this out." Terrence laughed, a manic, desperate sound. "I am facing federal prison, you stupid, arrogant girl. I married you for the Vance empire, and there is no empire. There is no money. There is no cabin. You lied to me for 3 years." He shoved her away with a look of pure revulsion. The golden couple, the picture of society perfection, was actively cannibalizing each other in the middle of a foreclosed ballroom. Terrence turned his furious gaze toward Richard, pointing an accusing finger at my father. "And you?" Terrence shouted at Richard. "You let her lie. You let me marry into this bankrupt fraud of a family. I am not going down for your ruined company. I will testify against you. I will tell Vanguard every single place you hid assets over the last decade." Richard stepped forward, his fists clenched, ready to physically fight his own son-in-law. The entire Vance family structure was collapsing into a violent, screaming spectacle of betrayal and self-preservation. Richard stepped forward, his fists clenched, ready to physically fight his own son-in-law. The entire Vance family structure was collapsing into a violent, screaming spectacle of betrayal and self-preservation. Richard lunged, but Catherine grabbed his arm, her manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. She dragged him back, terrified of the physical altercation that would surely summon the police to their doorstep. Terrence did not even look at his father-in-law. His eyes were entirely fixed on Penelope. He let out a harsh, barking laugh that held no humor, only pure, unadulterated venom. "You think you are the victim here?" Terrence shouted, stepping closer to his wife, his chest practically brushing hers. "I have spent 3 years listening to your insufferable whining. I have smiled at your shallow friends, attended your meaningless charity galas, and played the loving husband to a woman who possesses the emotional depth of a puddle. I did it because there was a light at the end of the tunnel. I did it because you were the heir to the Vance fortune." Penelope gasped, her face flushing crimson. "You used me!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "I endured you," Terrence roared back. "There is a massive difference. You are nothing without your trust fund, Penelope. You have no skills. You have no personality outside of your designer labels. You are a spoiled, arrogant brat who thought she was a queen. But you are bankrupt. You are worthless." Penelope slapped him. The sharp crack echoed through the grand ballroom. Terrence's head snapped to the side. A dark red mark instantly bloomed across his cheek. "You are a nobody!" Penelope screamed. Her fists clenched at her sides. "You were a mid-level accountant before my father gave you a title. I made you. I elevated you. You are nothing but a leech feeding off my family." Terrence turned his head back slowly, his eyes flashing with a dangerous, unrestrained fury. He took a step toward her, his fists balled so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Your family is a rotting carcass." Terrence spat, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. And I am the one who finally put it out of its misery. I took what I was owed. I took the money because Richard was too stupid to manage it, and you were too busy shopping to notice. I secured my own future since you clearly could not provide one. They circled each other like rabid animals. The perfect, glamorous society couple was dead, replaced by two greedy opportunists who had finally realized there was nothing left to steal from one another. The remaining guests watched in stunned, horrified silence. No one moved. No one intervened. I stood a few feet away, watching the cannibalization of the golden couple. I had waited 9 years for this exact reckoning, but I was not quite finished. Terrence thought his grand confession made him the smartest person in the room. He thought he had outmaneuvered the Vance family. He was wrong. "Don't be too mad at her, Terrence," I said, my voice slicing effortlessly through their screaming match. Terrence whipped his head around, glaring at me. "Stay out of this, Sloane. You have done enough damage." I ignored his order, taking a slow, measured step forward. My low heels clicked against the marble, a rhythmic countdown to his absolute destruction. "I mean it, Terrence." I continued, my tone deceptively light, carrying a razor-sharp edge. "You are being terribly harsh on my sister." After all, Penelope might be a spoiled, entitled brat who stole from her dying grandfather, but at least she did not use the embezzled corporate funds to buy a luxury condo in Miami for a 24-year-old fitness instructor. The ballroom fell so silent you could hear the crystal chandeliers softly chiming in the air currents. Terrence froze. The angry, flushed color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a chalky, terrified ghost. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Penelope snapped her head toward me, her tear-streaked face twisting into a mask of pure confusion. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What fitness instructor?" I tapped the screen of my tablet. Instantly, the massive media display behind me flickered to life. The foreclosure notice vanished, replaced by a series of high-resolution photographs. The first photo showed Terrence lounging on the deck of a sleek yacht in South Beach. Sitting across his lap was a stunning, deeply tanned young woman in a tiny string bikini. They were laughing, holding glasses of champagne, looking entirely carefree. The second photo showed them walking hand in hand out of a high-end Miami jewelry store, Terrence carrying two distinctively branded shopping bags. The third image was not a photograph. It was a scanned copy of a property deed. The address was a penthouse suite in one of Miami's most exclusive oceanfront high-rises. The purchase price was listed at $2.8 million, paid entirely in cash. The buyer listed on the deed was not Terrence. It was Chloe Harper, the fitness instructor currently draped across his lap on the yacht. The money Terrence stole from the corporate accounts did not go into a secure offshore retirement fund. I explained, my voice echoing clearly over the stunned silence. He did not secure his future. He funded a secret, lavish double life while you were busy picking out floral arrangements for the country club gala Penelope. Terrence took a frantic step backward, holding his hands up as if he could physically push the images off the screen. "That is fake," he shouted, his voice cracking with absolute panic. "Those are doctored photos." "She is lying." I tapped the tablet again. A bank statement appeared next to the deed. It showed a direct wire transfer from the Delaware shell company Terrence had created right into Chloe Harper's personal checking account. "Wire transfers do not lie, Terrence," I stated coldly. "You siphoned $4.2 million. You spent $2.8 million on the penthouse, $500,000 on the yacht charter and jewelry, and the rest is sitting in an account that the federal government is currently freezing as we speak. You have absolutely nothing left, and you are going to prison." Penelope turned slowly to face her husband. The arrogant, spiteful woman who had mocked me all my life was gone. She stared at the screen, her eyes wide, unblinking, tracing the lines of the property deed and the face of the young woman on the yacht. "You bought her a penthouse," Penelope whispered, the words barely escaping her throat. "My father's money. My money. You bought a 24-year-old a penthouse." "Penelope, listen to me," Terrence begged, reaching a shaking hand toward her. "It meant nothing. She meant nothing." Penelope did not answer. Her breath began to hitch, shallow and rapid. Her chest heaved. The realization of her absolute ruin was crashing down on her all at once. Her grandfather had disinherited her. Her family was bankrupt. Her home was being foreclosed on. Her husband did not love her, had never loved her, and had stolen her father's company to fund a secret life with another woman. She had no money. She had no status. She had no safety net. Penelope let out a strangled, gasping wheeze. Her hands flew to her chest, clawing at the expensive fabric of her emerald gown, as if she could not get enough air into her lungs. Her knees buckled. She collapsed onto the marble floor. This was not a theatrical performance. This was not one of her calculated dramatic tantrums designed to garner sympathy. This was a genuine, terrifying panic attack. She curled into a tight ball, gasping for air, her whole body shaking violently, as the perfect golden world she had built entirely on lies finally crushed her beneath its weight. Richard's fists trembled, but he did not swing. The raw, animalistic urge to strike Terence was suddenly overshadowed by a much colder, sharper terror. Terence's threat to expose the hidden assets to Vanguard Financial was the final nail in the coffin. If the federal authorities dug into the offshore accounts and the shell corporations Richard had used to keep his failing empire afloat, he would not just lose his house. He would spend the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary wearing a jumpsuit instead of Italian silk. The grand ballroom, once a symbol of his untouchable status, was now a crime scene of his own making. Penelope was still hyperventilating on the floor, her emerald gown pooled around her like a deflated parachute, her perfectly manicured hands gripping her hair as she rocked back and forth. Catherine was clutching the edge of a cocktail table, her face ashen, looking between her husband and her son-in-law, as if she had never met either of them. The last of the elite guests were practically sprinting for the valet, their whispers already writing the social obituary of the Vance family. Richard watched them flee, and I saw the exact moment the fight drained out of him. He was a cornered animal, completely out of ammunition. He could not bully me. He could not physically intimidate me. He could not outspend me. So he did the only thing a true narcissist knows how to do when the walls close in. He changed the narrative. Richard slowly lowered his fists. He took a deep, shuddering breath, smoothing the lapels of his custom tuxedo, attempting to reassemble the shattered pieces of his dignity. The furious, red-faced tyrant vanished in the blink of an eye. In his place stood the charismatic, persuasive businessman who had built a fortune decades ago. It was the face he wore when he was trying to close a massive deal, the warm, engaging mask that had fooled investors, politicians, and his own family for years. He turned away from Terence, completely dismissing the man who had just threatened to destroy him, and fixed his gaze entirely on me. He took a step toward me, his expression softening into a look of profound, manufactured pride. His eyes crinkled at the corners, radiating a fake fatherly warmth that made my skin crawl. "Sloane," he said, his voice dropping an octave, rich and smooth, as if we were having an intimate chat in his private study, rather than standing in the wreckage of his life. "I have to admit you played this brilliantly." I did not react. I simply watched him perform, keeping my face completely devoid of emotion. "You stood in the shadows." Richard continued, pacing slowly, his hands clasped behind his back in a show of total calm. "You observed. You waited for the perfect moment to strike. You gathered the intel, acquired the debt, and executed a flawless, hostile takeover right under our noses. It was ruthless. It was brilliant. It was exactly the kind of maneuver I would have pulled when I was your age." Terence let out a sound of absolute disbelief, staring at his father-in-law, as if the man had lost his mind. Catherine gasped, her hand flying to her throat, realizing what Richard was attempting to do. He was trying to recruit the enemy. Richard stopped a few feet away from me, his eyes gleaming with a desperate, manic hope. "You have proven you are the smartest one here, Sloane. You did not inherit Catherine's vanity. You did not inherit Penelope's weakness. You inherited my business acumen. You have my killer instinct. You are a true Vance." He gestured dismissively toward Terence, not even bothering to look at him. "We can throw Terence to the wolves," Richard offered, smoothly sacrificing his son-in-law without a single second of hesitation. "Let the authorities have him. We will press charges for the embezzlement hand over his financial records, throw him in jail, and clear the company's immediate liabilities. But we need to save the core enterprise. We need to protect the legacy. Richard took another step closer, extending a hand toward me, as if offering a truce. Drop this Vanguard debt, Sloan. Cancel the foreclosure on the estate. Forgive the corporate loans. In exchange, I will step down immediately. I will hand you the keys to the kingdom. I will make you the sole CEO of Vance Holdings tomorrow morning. We can restructure the board, eliminate the dead weight, and run this empire together. Just you and me, father and daughter, building a legacy that no one can ever touch. Catherine let out a sharp cry. Richard, you cannot give her the company that belongs to the family. Shut up, Catherine. Richard snapped his eyes, never leaving mine. Sloan is the only family that matters right now. She is the only one who can save us. He looked back at me, his smile widening, completely convinced he had just laid out the winning hand. He was offering me the very crown he had spent my entire life telling me I was unworthy to wear. He was offering me the seat at the head of the table, the ultimate validation I had craved as a naive 20-something, trying desperately to earn her father's love and respect. It was the ultimate psychological manipulation. He actually believed that my ambition was driven by a pathetic need for his approval. He believed that offering me a fancy title, a corner office, and his fake admiration would magically erase decades of emotional abuse, neglect, and vicious betrayal. He thought I was still that quiet, eager girl seeking her daddy's permission to exist in his world. I looked at his extended hand. I looked at the charming, persuasive smile plastered across his aging face, completely devoid of genuine remorse or self-awareness. A wave of profound, absolute disgust rolled through my stomach. The sheer arrogance of the offer was insulting. He had absolutely nothing left to give. His entire world was in ashes, yet he was still trying to dictate the terms of my surrender. I did not take his hand. I crossed my arms over my chest, my gaze cold and unyielding. You think I want to captain a sinking ship full of rats? I asked, my voice slicing through his forced warmth like a scalpel. The fake smile instantly vanished from Richard's face. His hand slowly dropped to his side. Your company is a hollow shell, Dad, I stated, stepping forward to ensure every word landed with maximum impact. It is bleeding cash, drowning in toxic liabilities, and completely devoid of any real value. You drove it into the ground with your own arrogance, and Terrence just sped up the inevitable crash. There is no legacy left to save. I looked him up and down, taking in the full measure of his pathetic desperation. I don't want your title, Dad, I said, delivering the final blow with chilling precision. I don't want your ruined legacy, and I certainly don't want to run a bankrupt empire with the man who built it on lies. I want my money. Richard's face crumbled. The formidable titan of industry, the man who had spent 3 decades ruling boardrooms through sheer intimidation, shrank into a pathetic, aging shell of himself. He took a slow, unsteady step backward, raising his hands in a gesture of absolute surrender. He retreated into the shadows of the room he had once commanded, his eyes fixed on the marble floor. He had nothing left to leverage. He could not bully me. He could not outspend me. He was completely out of ammunition. Catherine watched her husband surrender, and a terrifyingly cold calculation washed over her features. She realized the aggressive, dominating approach was dead. She realized Richard's corporate maneuvering was entirely useless. She had to pivot to the only weapon she had left in her arsenal. She had to use emotional warfare. Catherine smoothed the front of her ruined silk dress, adjusting her posture to project an aura of gentle, aristocratic grace. She looked down at Penelope, who was still gasping and violently trembling on the floor in the midst of a severe panic attack, and Catherine literally stepped over her daughter's legs without a second glance. A mother's love in the Vance household had always been entirely conditional, reserved only for those who could elevate the family name. Penelope was now a liability, so Catherine simply discarded her. She walked toward me, her sharp, hateful expression softening into a mask of deep manufactured maternal sorrow. She reached out, her hands fluttering in the air as if she desperately wanted to embrace me, but did not quite dare to cross the boundary. Sloan, please. Catherine began, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated emotion. This has gone entirely too far. We are destroying each other. Your father is a proud, stubborn man, and Terence has clearly lost his mind. But you and I, we are family. We are blood. We are mother and daughter. We need to find a way to heal from this horrible tragedy before it consumes us all. I said absolutely nothing. I stood perfectly still, letting her spin her desperate sticky web. I know you are angry about the Aspen property, Catherine continued, her voice dropping to a soothing, conciliatory whisper. And I understand why you feel defensive. You loved your grandfather. But let us be fiercely practical, darling. You live in a tiny, cramped apartment in the city. You work constantly at your firm. You do not have the time, the energy, or the resources to maintain a sprawling mountain estate. The property taxes and the upkeep alone will completely bankrupt you within a single year. It is not a gift, Sloane. It is a massive financial burden. She took another cautious step closer, lowering her voice even further as if sharing an intimate secret meant only for my ears. I want to help you, Catherine murmured, her eyes wide and pleading. I want to make things right between us. I will buy the cabin from you. Personally, I have a private secure account that your father cannot touch and Vanguard cannot seize. I will wire $200,000 directly into your checking account tomorrow morning. It will give you a beautiful liquid nest egg. You can buy a nicer apartment. You can travel the world. You can start fresh, completely unburdened by this toxic family mess. Just sign the property deed over to me tonight, and I will take all the stress off your shoulders. Let your mother take care of you. The sheer audacity of her proposal was staggering. She was standing in the wreckage of her entire life, watching her golden daughter hyperventilate on the floor, and she was still actively trying to rob me under the vile guise of maternal charity. I looked at her carefully crafted expression of concern. I looked at the fake tears welling in the corners of her eyes, and then I laughed. It was not a polite, socially acceptable chuckle. It was a sharp, echoing laugh that erupted from my chest and cut straight through the heavy, suffocating tension of the grand ballroom. I laughed directly in my mother's face, shaking my head at her absolute delusion. Catherine recoiled violently. Her fake warmth evaporated in a millisecond, her features snapping back into a tight, hateful glare. "What is so funny?" Catherine snapped, her voice losing its melodic pitch and turning harsh. "I am offering you a generous lifeline, you ungrateful girl. You are offering me a fraction of a percentage," I corrected her, my laughter fading into a cold, lethal stare. "You really think I am that stupid, Mother? You think I spent the last decade building a career in corporate finance without learning how to run a basic asset valuation on my own properties?" Catherine swallowed hard. The color began to drain from her cheeks, leaving her perfectly powdered face looking sallow and gray. She took a small step backward, her hands dropping to her sides. "You think I do not know about the new commercial zoning laws in Aspen?" I asked, my voice ringing out clearly so every single person in the room could hear. The county council passed the rezoning initiative exactly 6 weeks ago. The land Grandpa Arthur's cabin sits on is no longer restricted to residential use. It is now prime commercial real estate located right at the base of the massive new ski resort expansion. Richard's head snapped up. He stepped out of the shadows, his eyes wide with renewed, absolute terror. He knew exactly where I was going. "A luxury resort developer approached you and Dad last month." I continued delivering the facts with the merciless precision of an executioner. "They want to bulldoze Grandpa's cabin and build a massive boutique hotel on that exact ridge. And they offered you $15 million for the land." A collective gasp rose from the remaining staff members and the few straggling guests lingering by the exit doors. Even Terence, who was currently facing federal prison time, stared at Catherine in absolute shock. Penelope stopped gasping for a fraction of a second, her tear-streaked face turning upward to stare at her mother in total disbelief. $15 million, I repeated, letting the massive figure hang heavily in the silent air. But there was a major problem. Grandpa Arthur had already filed the legal addendum giving the property entirely to me. You could not sell what you did not legally own. That is why you were so desperate to claim a clerical error. That is why you demanded I hand over the deed tonight. You wanted me to sign it over for nothing. You offered me a pathetic $200,000 so you could quietly pocket the $15 million and save your bankrupt, fraudulent lifestyle. Catherine was completely speechless. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. Her ultimate manipulation, her grand final safety net, was entirely exposed and destroyed. She looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. She finally realized that I held every single card, and she held absolutely nothing. "You did not want to help me, Mother," I stated, my voice dropping to a freezing absolute zero. "You wanted to rob me, just like Penelope robbed Grandpa on his deathbed. You are all exactly the same." The silence in the grand ballroom was deafening. The total, undisputed defeat of the Vance family was finally complete. They were stripped bare, exposed as frauds, thieves, and bankrupt failures. There was nowhere left to hide. There was no lie left to spin. Then a sharp, piercing sound shattered the quiet. The front doorbell rang. Its deep, melodic chime echoed through the vast foyer and poured into the ballroom, startling everyone in the room. Catherine's head snapped toward the grand entryway. Her pristine, aristocratic facade was completely gone, replaced by the frantic, unhinged paranoia of a cornered criminal. "Who is that?" Catherine snapped, her voice shrill and hysterical. She spun back to glare at me, her hands balled into tight fists. "Who did you invite to my house? Sloane? Have you called the police? Have you brought the press here to completely ruin us?" I looked at my mother, taking in her sheer, unadulterated terror. I offered her a calm, genuinely relaxed smile. "No police, Mother," I replied smoothly. "Just a character witness." Heavy, purposeful footsteps echoed against the marble floor of the foyer. The massive double doors swung fully open, pushed wide by the remaining valet staff. A figure stepped into the brilliant light of the entryway, casting a long, commanding shadow into the ruined ballroom. Aunt Beatrice stepped into the foyer. She wore a sharply tailored charcoal trench coat over a pristine ivory suit. Her silver hair was pulled back into an immaculate French twist, and her posture was as rigid and unyielding as a steel beam. Beatrice looked like a high court judge, arriving to deliver a final, inescapable verdict. She radiated an aura of absolute authority that instantly sucked the remaining oxygen out of the room. "Get out of my house!" Richard bellowed. His voice cracked, betraying the raw, primal panic bubbling beneath his rage. "You have no right to be here. You were banished from this family 15 years ago. Beatrice Security, remove this woman immediately." The remaining valet staff and caterers did not move a single muscle. They simply stared, utterly mesmerized by the spectacular implosion of the Vance dynasty. Beatrice did not flinch. She calmly handed her leather gloves to a stunned waiter standing by the door and walked into the grand ballroom with the measured, unhurried pace of an apex predator. She did not look at the extravagant floral arrangements or the crystal chandeliers. She ignored Penelope, who was still gasping and clutching her chest on the marble floor. She bypassed Catherine, who had practically pressed herself against the wall in terror. Beatrice walked directly to me. She stopped, looked me up and down, and smiled. It was a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes, completely devoid of the toxic transactional warmth my parents always used. "You did beautifully, Sloane," Beatrice said, her voice clear, resonant, and carrying effortlessly across the silent room. "Arthur would be incredibly proud of the woman you have become. You fought exactly the way he always hoped you would." I felt a sudden, unexpected tightness in my throat. For my entire life, I had been gaslit into believing I was the problem. I had been told I was cold, difficult, and unworthy. Hearing this brilliant, formidable woman validate my existence and my grandfather's love was the ultimate vindication. Richard staggered forward, his face turning a dangerous mottled shade of purple. "I said get out!" he screamed, pointing a shaking finger at the foyer. "She has no business bringing you here. This is a private family matter. You are not part of this family. You lost the right to use the word family a long time ago." "Richard," Beatrice countered, turning her steely gaze onto her younger brother. "I received Sloane's message about your pathetic attempt to contest Arthur's will." It sounded painfully familiar. In fact, it sounded exactly like the script you used on me 15 years ago. Richard opened his mouth to shout another order, but the words died in his throat. He took a step back, intimidated by his older sister's sheer, uncompromising presence. Beatrice looked around the room, addressing the straggling guests. The staff and the shell shocked Catherine. For those of you who only know the polished Vance family myth, allow me to correct the historical record. Richard did not build this corporate empire from scratch. He stole its foundation from me. Catherine tried to speak, raising a trembling hand. Beatrice, please let us not drag up the past. Save your breath, Catherine. Beatrice snapped, slicing through my mother's fake diplomacy like a blade. You were complicit then, and you are complicit now. You helped him forge the narrative that I was the black sheep, just like you tried to do to Sloane. Beatrice turned her attention back to Richard, dissecting him with surgical precision. When our parents built their primary manufacturing firm, I was the one running the operations. Beatrice stated, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. I doubled their revenue in a decade. But when our father's health began to decline, Richard swooped in. He isolated our parents. He changed the estate documents behind my back. He used the exact same gaslighting tactics he tried tonight. He told the board of directors I was emotionally unstable. He claimed I was financially incompetent. He manufactured fake accounting errors to justify seizing control of the firm that I had spent my entire adult life expanding. Richard was visibly shaking. His hands trembled at his sides. His carefully constructed reality, the myth of the self-made billionaire titan, was being dismantled brick by brick and broadcasted to everyone he had ever tried to impress. The difference, Beatrice said, turning back to me with eyes full of fierce pride, is that Sloane is far smarter than I was. When Richard stole my birthright, I walked away to save my sanity. I let him have the company because I thought my peace of mind was worth the price of his theft. But Sloane stayed. She watched you. She learned exactly how your toxic machinery operates, and she dismantled it from the inside out. She beat you at your own corrupt game. You are just bitter, Richard spat. His voice had lost its thunder, reducing to a pathetic, desperate hiss. You have been holding a grudge for a decade and a half because you lacked the vision to lead. You are nothing but a jealous exile. You have no power here, Beatrice. This is still my house. I still have leverage. I have corporate investors. I have banks backing me. Vanguard might hold some debt, but I will secure the capital to crush both of you. Beatrice let out a low, melodic laugh that sent a visible shiver down Richard's spine. It was a laugh of absolute terrifying superiority. She reached into the pocket of her tailored trench coat and retrieved a sleek silver business card case. With a sharp snap, she opened it, extracted a single heavy card and tossed it onto the marble floor. It landed precisely at Richard's feet. You have always been terrible at doing your due diligence, little brother, Beatrice said, her tone dripping with absolute authority. You have spent the last 3 weeks practically begging Liberty Sovereign Bank for an emergency $8 million bailout loan. You needed that cash to cover the margins Terrence destroyed. You submitted fraudulent revenue projections, hoping the loan officers would blindly approve it based on the Vance name alone. Richard stared at the business card resting by his expensive leather shoes. His breathing completely stopped. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. I am a senior partner at Liberty Sovereign, Beatrice announced, her words dropping like an anvil in the silent ballroom. I sit on the Executive Risk Committee. I am here to personally inform you that your loan application is denied and your existing credit line is officially terminated. Richard stared at the heavy, silver-embossed business card resting by his expensive leather shoes. The absolute finality of Beatrice's words hung in the stale, suffocating air of the ballroom. His corporate empire was officially dead. There would be no secret bailout. There would be no last-minute financial restructuring to hide the bleeding assets. Liberty Sovereign Bank was the only institution left on the eastern seaboard that had not completely blacklisted the Vance family, and Beatrice had just severed that final fraying rope with a single sentence. Richard stumbled backward, his knees buckling until he collapsed heavily into a gilded accent chair. He buried his face in his hands, a broken, defeated man whose entire identity had just been erased. Catherine remained frozen against the silk-paneled wall, her eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for an escape hatch that did not exist. The aristocratic mask she had worn for decades had melted away, leaving behind nothing but raw, undisguised terror. But it was Terence who shattered the stunned silence. A guttural, animalistic sound of pure panic tore from his throat. The termination of the credit line meant the immediate discovery of his massive embezzlement. The federal authorities would be in his office by Monday morning, seizing hard drives and freezing accounts. He would not just lose his country club membership and his fleet of imported luxury cars. He was facing a decade in a federal penitentiary. The polished, arrogant son-in-law completely vanished. Terence scrambled across the marble floor like a deranged madman, diving toward the designer leather briefcase he had discarded near the cocktail bar earlier that evening. His hands shook violently as he snapped the brass locks open, frantically tearing through manila folders, financial ledgers, and legal pads. Confidential papers scattered across the floor, fluttering around Penelope, who was still rocking back and forth in a state of catatonic shock. "It doesn't matter," Terence screamed, his voice cracking with absolute hysteria. He ripped a thick cream-colored document from the bottom of the briefcase and held it up like a holy relic. "The game is not over. You think you are so brilliant, Sloane. You think you can just march in here, buy up our debt, and strip us of our own company. You missed a crucial detail." He practically sprinted back toward the center of the room, shoving the document in my general direction. His chest heaved with exertion, his face glistening with a sheen of cold sweat. "I have a contract right here," Terence bellowed, his eyes wild and manic. "Signed by Sloane, exactly 9 years ago. A legally binding, irrevocable proxy agreement, transferring her corporate voting rights entirely to Penelope." I kept my posture completely relaxed, my arms crossed comfortably over my chest. I watched him rant, refusing to give him a single ounce of emotional reaction. Catherine suddenly snapped out of her paralyzed state. The mention of a legal loophole acted like a shot of adrenaline straight to her heart. She rushed to Terence's side, snatching the document from his trembling hands to read the bold print at the top of the page. A malicious, triumphant smile spread across her face. The fake maternal concern she had displayed minutes earlier evaporated, entirely replaced by the vicious, calculating predator I had known my entire life. "See?" Catherine sneered, stepping forward to vigorously wave the paper in my face. "You have no power here. You spent all this time orchestrating a hostile takeover, acquiring Vanguard debt, and playing your little corporate spy games, but you forgot your own stupidity. You always were too naive for your own good, Sloane. You signed this right before you moved into the city. You handed over your entire stake in Vance Holdings to your sister because you were desperate for our approval. You handed us the keys years ago." Richard lifted his head from his hands. A spark of manic hope ignited in his eyes. He pushed himself out of the chair, his posture instantly straightening as the old bullying patriarch returned to life. "If Penelope holds your voting rights, your hostile takeover is completely null and void," Richard declared, a dark, victorious chuckle rumbling deep in his chest. "We hold the majority vote. We can instantly block your aggressive maneuvers, invalidate the debt acquisition, and expel you from the board entirely. You just spent millions of dollars to bankrupt yourself, Sloane. You lose. We keep the company. We keep everything." They stood shoulder to shoulder, Richard, Catherine, and Terence forming a united front of absolute delusion. They were so blinded by their own greed and desperation that they failed to realize they had just walked directly into a steel trap. Beatrice stood beside me, perfectly still, her sharp eyes studying the document in Catherine's hand. She did not say a word, allowing me to dismantle my family at my own pace. I looked at the piece of paper Catherine was practically crushing in her manic grip. I remembered the exact day Terence had cornered me in my father's study 9 years ago. I remembered him shoving a stack of routine tax documents in front of me, aggressively demanding my signature, exploiting the fact that I was a grieving, overwhelmed 20-something trying to process my grandfather's recent passing. He had quietly slipped this fraudulent proxy agreement into the middle of the stack, assuming I was too distracted to read the fine print. But I had not been as naive as they believed. I had caught the discrepancy instantly. I had known exactly what Terence was attempting to do. And instead of confronting him, I had let him take the document. I had let him bury it in his files, knowing that one day he would be desperate enough to use it. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply offered them a smile so chilling it caused Terence to physically recoil. "Take a closer look at the notary stamp on that document, Terence," I instructed, my voice echoing with lethal, unyielding calm. "Go ahead. Read the name printed on the official blue ink seal at the very bottom of the final page." Catherine frowned, her triumphant sneer faltering. She hastily flipped to the last page, her eyes squinting to read the small stamped text. Terence leaned over her shoulder, his breathing shallow and rapid. "It is signed by Arthur Pendleton," I stated, enunciating every single syllable with crystal clarity. "The prominent public notary who handled all of the Vance family's real estate transactions for over 40 years. It is his official seal. It is his signature validating that I supposedly signed away my voting rights to Penelope exactly 9 years ago." Richard frowned, clearly confused by the direction of my argument. "Yes, and Arthur was our sworn notary. It is perfectly legal." "Is it?" I asked, tilting my head. "Because Arthur Pendleton died of a massive stroke 10 years ago." The color drained from Terence's face instantly. He stumbled backward as if the piece of paper had suddenly caught fire in his hands. Catherine dropped the document entirely. It fluttered to the marble floor, landing right next to Beatrice's bank card. "You forged the date, Terence?" I continued, my voice slicing through the room like a guillotine. "You slipped a backdated proxy form into a stack of old tax paperwork, completely forgetting to check the status of the notary whose stolen stamp you used to legitimize it. You cannot have a dead man notarize a legal contract a full year after his own funeral." Terence began to shake violently. He backed away, his hands raised in the air, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit. "You just presented a forged legal document," I said, delivering the final crushing blow. "You presented it with the explicit intent to commit corporate fraud and manipulate a hostile takeover. And you did it right in front of a licensed forensic auditor and a senior executive of Liberty Sovereign Bank." Richard stared at the heavy silver-embossed business card resting by his expensive leather shoes. The absolute finality of Beatrice's words hung in the stale, suffocating air of the ballroom. His corporate empire was officially dead. There would be no secret bailout. There would be no last-minute financial restructuring to hide his bleeding assets. Liberty Sovereign Bank was the only institution left on the eastern seaboard that had not completely blacklisted the Vance family, and Beatrice had just severed that final fraying rope with a single devastating sentence. He stumbled backward, his knees buckling until he collapsed heavily into a gilded accent chair. He buried his face in his hands, a broken, defeated man whose entire untouchable identity had just been erased in a matter of seconds. Catherine remained frozen against the silk-paneled wall, her eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for an escape hatch that simply did not exist. The aristocratic mask she had worn for decades had melted away, leaving behind nothing but raw, undisguised terror. But it was Terence who shattered the stunned silence. A guttural, animalistic sound of pure panic tore from his throat. The termination of the credit line meant the immediate discovery of his massive embezzlement. The federal authorities would be inside his corner office by Monday morning, seizing hard drives and freezing his offshore accounts. He would not just lose his country club membership and his fleet of imported luxury cars. He was facing a decade in a federal penitentiary, and he knew it. The polished, arrogant son-in-law completely vanished. Driven to absolute madness by losing everything, Terence scrambled across the marble floor like a deranged man. He dove toward the designer leather briefcase he had discarded near the cocktail bar earlier that evening. His hands shook violently as he snapped the brass locks open, frantically tearing through manila folders, financial ledgers, and legal pads. Confidential papers scattered across the floor in a chaotic mess, fluttering around Penelope, who was still rocking back and forth in a state of catatonic shock. "It doesn't matter!" Terence screamed, his voice cracking with absolute hysteria. He ripped a thick, cream-colored document from the bottom of the briefcase and held it up like a holy relic. "The game is not over. You think you are so brilliant, Sloane. You think you can just march in here, buy up our debt, and strip us of our own company. You missed a crucial detail. He practically sprinted back toward the center of the room, shoving the document in my general direction. His chest heaved with exertion, his face glistening with a sheen of cold sweat. I have a contract right here signed by Sloane 9 years ago, transferring her corporate voting rights to Penelope. Terrence bellowed, his eyes wild and manic. It is a legally binding, irrevocable proxy agreement. I kept my posture completely relaxed, my arms crossed comfortably over my chest. I watched him rant, refusing to give him a single ounce of emotional reaction. Catherine suddenly snapped out of her paralyzed state. The mention of a legal loophole acted like a shot of adrenaline straight to her heart. She rushed to Terrence's side, snatching the document from his trembling hands to read the bold print at the top of the page. A malicious, triumphant smile spread across her face. The fake maternal concern she had displayed minutes earlier evaporated entirely, replaced by the vicious, calculating predator I had known my entire life. Richard lifted his head from his hands. A spark of manic hope ignited in his eyes. He pushed himself out of the chair, his posture instantly straightening as the old bullying patriarch returned to life. Richard and Catherine looked triumphant, standing shoulder to shoulder in a united front of absolute delusion. "See, you have no power here," they sneered in unison. "You spent all this time orchestrating a hostile takeover, acquiring Vanguard debt, and playing your little corporate spy games. But you forgot your own stupidity," Catherine yelled, stepping forward to vigorously wave the paper in my face. "You always were too naive for your own good, Sloane. You signed this right before you moved into the city. You handed over your entire stake in Vance Holdings to your sister because you were desperate for our approval. You handed us the keys years ago. If Penelope holds your voting rights, your hostile takeover is completely null and void," Richard declared, a dark, victorious chuckle rumbling deep in his chest. "We hold the majority vote. We can instantly block your aggressive maneuvers, invalidate the debt acquisition, and expel you from the board entirely. You just spent millions of dollars to bankrupt yourself, Sloane. You lose. We keep the company. We keep everything." They were so blinded by their own greed and desperation that they failed to realize they had just walked directly into a steel trap. Beatrice stood beside me, perfectly still, her sharp eyes studying the document in Catherine's hand. She did not say a word, allowing me to dismantle my family at my own pace. I looked at the piece of paper Catherine was practically crushing in her manic grip. I remembered the exact day Terrence had cornered me in my father's study 9 years ago. I remembered him shoving a stack of routine tax documents in front of me, aggressively demanding my signature, exploiting the fact that I was a grieving, overwhelmed 20-something trying to process my grandfather's recent passing. He had quietly slipped this fraudulent proxy agreement into the middle of the stack, assuming I was too distracted to read the fine print. But I had not been as naive as they believed. I had caught the discrepancy instantly. I had known exactly what Terrence was attempting to do, and instead of confronting him, I had let him take the document. I had let him bury it in his files, knowing that one day he would be desperate enough to use it against me. Sloane doesn't even blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply offered them a smile so chilling it caused Terrence to physically recoil. "Take a closer look at the notary stamp on that document, Terrence," I instructed, my voice echoing with lethal, unyielding calm. "Go ahead. Read the name printed on the official blue ink seal at the very bottom of the final page." Catherine frowned, her triumphant sneer faltering. She hastily flipped to the last page, her eyes squinting to read the small stamped text. Terrence leaned over her shoulder, his breathing shallow and rapid. "It's signed by Arthur Pendleton," I stated, enunciating every single syllable with crystal clarity. "The prominent public notary who handled all of the Vance family's real estate transactions for over 40 years. It is his official seal. It is his signature validating that I supposedly signed away my voting rights to Penelope exactly 9 years ago." Richard frowned, clearly confused by the direction of my argument. "Yes, and Arthur was our sworn notary. It is perfectly legal." "Arthur died 10 years ago," I said, tilting my head. The color drained from Terrence's face instantly. He stumbled backward as if the piece of paper had suddenly caught fire in his hands. Catherine dropped the document entirely. It fluttered to the marble floor, landing right next to Beatrice's bank card. "You forged the date, Terence." I continued, my voice slicing through the room like a guillotine. "You slipped a backdated proxy form into a stack of old tax paperwork, completely forgetting to check the status of the notary whose stolen stamp you used to legitimize it. You cannot have a dead man notarize a legal contract a full year after his own funeral." Terence began to shake violently. He backed away, his hands raised in the air, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit. "You just presented a forged legal document in front of a licensed forensic auditor and a bank executive," I said, delivering the final crushing blow. "You presented it with the explicit intent to commit corporate fraud and manipulate a hostile takeover." The absolute silence in the grand ballroom was suffocating. Terence stared at the forged document resting on the marble floor, his entire body shaking as the catastrophic magnitude of his error finally registered. He had just confessed to committing a federal felony while standing directly in front of a licensed forensic auditor and a senior executive of Liberty Sovereign Bank. His chest heaved rapidly, his eyes darting frantically between me and Beatrice, searching for a loophole that simply did not exist. There was no clever corporate spin to save him now. He had handed me the final nail for his own coffin. Before Catherine could even attempt to open her mouth and weave another desperate web of lies, a high-pitched piercing wail tore through the quiet night air. The sound started as a distant echoing hum, but rapidly amplified, tearing through the manicured estate grounds with terrifying speed. Within seconds, the massive sweeping windows of the grand ballroom were illuminated by an aggressive strobing wash of red and blue. The flashing lights bounced off the crystal chandeliers, and the mirrored walls casting erratic, frantic shadows across the terrified faces of my family. The heavy crunch of tires violently braking on the gravel driveway signaled their arrival. Catherine lunged forward, her manicured fingers digging into the fabric of my jacket like sharp, desperate talons. Her pristine, aristocratic mask completely disintegrated, leaving behind nothing but unhinged, wild panic. "You called the police on your own family!" she screamed, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. Her eyes were wide, darting toward the flashing lights and back to my face. "Cancel them immediately, Sloan. Tell them it is a massive mistake. We can handle this internally. I will write you a check right now. Just send them away." I looked down at her desperate, clawing grip. With a calm, deliberate motion, I smoothly pried her trembling fingers off my clothing, taking a distinct step backward to create a physical boundary between us. "I didn't call the local police, Mom," I stated, my voice completely devoid of any sympathy or warmth. "When I submitted the embezzlement and wire fraud evidence to the SEC this morning, they apparently notified the FBI." A collective gasp escaped the remaining staff members, huddled near the kitchen corridor. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom burst open with a deafening crash. A tactical team of federal agents, flanked by heavily armed local law enforcement officers, flooded into the elegant space with calculated, terrifying precision. Their dark windbreakers bore the bold yellow letters of the FBI, standing out starkly against the opulent backdrop of my parents' ruined gala. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a gaze as hard and uncompromising as flint, stepped into the center of the room. He scanned the terrified crowd and instantly locked his eyes directly on Terence. Terence did not hesitate. The polished, arrogant corporate executive vanished instantly, replaced entirely by a panicked, cornered fugitive, operating on pure animal instinct. He spun on his heel and bolted toward the glass terrace doors at the back of the ballroom. His expensive leather shoes slipped wildly on the polished marble. He blindly crashed into a tall cocktail table, sending a tower of crystal champagne flutes shattering onto the floor in a cascade of glass and expensive liquor, but he kept running. He did not make it past the catering station. Two federal agents moved with terrifying, practiced speed, effortlessly intercepting his path. One agent grabbed Terence forcefully by the shoulder, spinning his momentum around, while the second agent tackled him brutally to the floor. The sickening, heavy thud of Terence hitting the hard marble echoed sharply through the cavernous room. Within seconds, his arms were violently wrenched behind his back, and the harsh, metallic click of handcuffs secured his wrists. Terence began sobbing openly, his face pressed against the cold stone, babbling incoherent, pathetic pleas for mercy. Penelope, witnessing her husband being violently restrained, immediately escalated her own performance. She rolled onto her side, clutching her throat with both hands, and let out a series of dramatic, high-pitched shrieks that pierced the air. "I can't breathe!" Penelope wailed, her hands thrashing wildly as she kicked her legs against the floor. "Call an ambulance. I am having a heart attack. Help me." The lead agent ignored the chaos of Terence being hauled to his feet and marched directly over to where Penelope lay thrashing on the floor. He did not call for medics. He did not kneel to offer a comforting hand. He looked down at her with an expression of absolute withering disgust. "Save the performance for the judge, Mrs. Vance," the agent commanded, his voice slicing cleanly through her fake hysterics. "You are not having a medical emergency. However, you are currently under active federal investigation for receiving stolen corporate funds and actively aiding in tax evasion. I highly suggest you sit up, compose yourself, and remain absolutely silent." Penelope instantly stopped gasping. The dramatic thrashing ceased in a millisecond. Her mouth snapped shut as sheer, unadulterated terror paralyzed her completely. She sat up slowly, wrapping her arms around her knees, staring at the agent with hollow, terrified eyes. Richard, watching his golden daughter completely silenced and his chosen successor being dragged toward the exit in handcuffs, could not process the total destruction of his empire. Driven by decades of unchecked arrogance, he puffed out his chest and marched aggressively toward the lead agent. He adjusted his bespoke tuxedo jacket, desperately attempting to summon the ghosts of his former untouchable power. "Do you have any idea who you are dealing with?" Richard roared, pointing a trembling finger directly at the federal agent's face. "I am Richard Vance. I golf with the governor. I personally fund the police pension program in this county. I will have your badge for storming into my private residence like a common street thug. Remove those cuffs from my son-in-law immediately, or I will see you all fired and blacklisted by tomorrow morning." The lead agent did not blink. He did not react to the shouting. He casually reached into the inside breast pocket of his windbreaker, retrieved a neatly folded thick legal document, and slapped it directly against Richard's chest with a resounding smack. "You're next, sir," the agent stated, his voice ringing with chilling, absolute finality, obstruction of justice and corporate fraud. The lead agent did not even wait for Richard to formulate a coherent response. He simply released the heavy legal document, letting the subpoena flatten against Richard's pristine tuxedo shirt before stepping smoothly around the frozen patriarch. Behind him, two uniformed officers hauled Terence off the floor by his armpits. Terence's expensive Italian loafers dragged uselessly across the scuffed marble as they marched him out the grand double doors. Through the shattered glass of the terrace, I watched with absolute detachment as they shoved my former brother-in-law into the back of a waiting squad car. The heavy metal door slammed shut with a definitive thud, instantly cutting off his pathetic, whimpering pleas. He was trapped behind the reinforced glass, leaving only the relentless rhythmic strobing of the red and blue emergency lights washing over his tear-streaked face. Penelope remained on the floor, but her theatrical performance had abruptly ended. The lead federal agent had completely bypassed her, tossing a curt, dismissive instruction to a junior officer to keep her contained for intense questioning. The realization that her fake medical emergency was entirely useless stripped away her final layer of defense. Penelope began to hyperventilate for real. Her chest heaved in rapid, shallow, terrifying gasps. Her perfectly manicured hands clawed violently at the collar of her heavily beaded designer gown as genuine suffocating panic seized her lungs. She looked toward the foyer, watching her husband being driven away in the back of a police cruiser, and then looked desperately at her parents. The golden child, the sister who had spent her entire life stealing my accomplishments and mocking my ambition, was now reduced to a trembling, gasping mess on the floor of a ruined gala. Richard and Catherine were utterly broken. The majestic Vance family ballroom, an architectural monument explicitly designed to project untouchable wealth and generational power, had been swiftly reduced to a humiliating crime scene. Federal agents were already moving systematically through the adjacent corridors, securing the private financial offices, boxing up external hard drives, and barking clinical orders into their shoulder radios. The remaining catering staff and the straggling, terrified gala guests had been corralled into the foyer by local police, becoming captive, wide-eyed witnesses to the total catastrophic dismantling of the Vance dynasty. Richard stood completely motionless, staring down at the federal subpoena crushed in his trembling fist. The paper shook violently in his grip. His jaw worked silently as the catastrophic magnitude of his new reality finally breached the reinforced walls of his colossal ego. His money was frozen. His powerful political connections were suddenly worthless. The state governor he bragged about golfing with would undoubtedly deny ever knowing his name by tomorrow morning. He was facing a massive federal indictment, stripped of his unearned corporate throne and publicly exposed as a massive fraud. His entire identity, built on the stolen foundation of Beatrice's hard work, had evaporated into thin air. Catherine was in no better shape. Her rigid, aristocratic posture had completely collapsed. She slumped heavily against the silk-paneled wall, her eyes wide, bloodshot, and frantic, as she stared at the smoking ruins of her carefully curated social empire. The exclusive charity galas, the country club luncheons, the glossy magazine covers showcasing her impeccable taste. It was all gone forever. She would be a pariah by sunrise, a disgraced, penniless socialite whose very name would be whispered with toxic glee in the high society circles she once ruthlessly ruled. Slowly, almost simultaneously, my parents turned their hollow, desperate eyes toward me. For 27 years, they had looked at me with nothing but thinly veiled contempt. I had always been the designated family scapegoat, the quiet disappointment, the difficult daughter who lacked the vicious predatory instinct they believed was required to carry the Vance legacy. Now standing beside Beatrice in my impeccably tailored suit, wielding the absolute power to either save them or bury them entirely, I was their only remaining lifeline. Richard took a shaky, incredibly hesitant step forward. The aggressive, booming patriarch who had threatened to destroy me just minutes prior was completely gone. His broad shoulders hunched inward, his knees visibly wobbling beneath the crushing weight of his absolute ruin. Catherine followed closely behind him, her hands trembling uncontrollably as she clutched the sides of her ruined silk gown. Then the impossible happened. Richard Vance, a man who had built a hollow empire on pride, manipulation, and intimidation, let his knees buckle. He dropped heavily onto the cold marble floor, landing squarely at my feet. Catherine instantly collapsed right beside him, her perfectly coiffed hair falling in wild strands across her face as she sank to her knees. The invincible architects of my childhood misery were now prostrating themselves before me, entirely shattered and begging for mercy. "Sloane, please!" Richard choked out his voice, reduced to a ragged, pathetic rasp that barely carried over the noise of the federal agents. "You cannot let this happen. You beat us. You proved your point. We surrender completely. But you have to stop them from taking me away. Use your corporate lawyers. Use your connections at Liberty Sovereign Bank. You have the capital and the leverage to bury this entire investigation before the financial press gets a hold of it." Catherine reached out her hands, shaking violently as she attempted to grab the fabric of my tailored jacket. "We are your family." "Sloane," she cried out, thick, dark tears finally spilling over her mascara-stained cheeks. "We're your parents. We gave you everything. You can't let them take everything. You cannot just stand there and let them take us away. You have to help us." I looked down at the two pathetic figures shivering on the floor. These were the people who had spent my entire existence tearing down my confidence, isolating me from anyone who cared about me, and gaslighting me into believing I was completely worthless. I searched my heart for a shred of pity. I searched for a flicker of anger. I found absolutely nothing. I felt only the cold, clinical, highly satisfying precision of a corporate auditor closing a perfectly balanced, undeniable ledger. I easily pried my mother's trembling hand off my jacket, taking a distinct, deliberate step backward to create a permanent physical boundary between us. I did not raise my voice to shout. I did not offer them a comforting smile or a spiteful, arrogant sneer. I simply operated with the precise, ruthless efficiency they had inadvertently taught me to perfect over the years. I didn't call the local police, Mom. I stated, my voice completely devoid of any sympathy or warmth. When I submitted the embezzlement and wire fraud evidence to the SEC this morning, they apparently notified the FBI. I reached over to the sleek leather briefcase Beatrice had quietly placed on the small side table next to me. I snapped the brass locks open, the crisp sound echoing sharply against the marble floors, and extracted a single flawless legal document. It was printed on heavy premium stock filled with dense, uncompromising legal jargon drafted by the most aggressive corporate attorneys in the city. I held the document out, letting the heavy paper hover just inches above Richard's tear-stained, terrified face. "Sign over your remaining 49% equity in the company. To me," I commanded, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that brooked absolutely zero negotiation. "Relinquish all claims to the Aspen property and hand over the keys to this house. Do it, and I won't press civil charges against you." Richard stared at the thick stack of legal paper as if it were a live explosive. The silence that followed my ultimatum was absolute, broken only by the distant muffled sound of Terrence's squad car pulling out of the gravel driveway, its sirens fading into the cold night. The flashing red and blue lights still painted the ballroom walls, a relentless strobing reminder of the federal agents securing the perimeter just outside the double mahogany doors. This was the moment, the total inescapable collapse of the Vance family mythology. Richard reached out with a hand that shook so violently he could barely grasp the edge of the document. He pulled it toward his chest, his bloodshot eyes scanning the dense, uncompromising paragraphs. Every single clause, every carefully constructed sentence drafted by my legal team was designed to strip him of his remaining dignity, his assets, and his unchecked power. The empire he had stolen from his own sister, the wealth he had used to terrorize and belittle me for decades, was being systematically dismantled right before his eyes. "You cannot do this," Richard whispered, his voice cracking, a hollow wheeze rattling in his chest. "You are asking me to erase myself. You are asking me to sign away my entire life. I am offering you a choice." I corrected him, my tone completely flat and devoid of any emotional attachment. "You can sign those papers, surrender the assets you fraudulently managed, and avoid a civil lawsuit that will completely bankrupt whatever hidden offshore accounts you have left. Or you can refuse. If you refuse, I will hand this entire dossier over to the federal agents currently bagging up your hard drives down the hall. They already have Terrence. They already have Penelope. I am perfectly happy to let them take you and Mom tonight as well." Catherine let out a jagged, hysterical gasp. She scrambled closer to Richard on the marble floor, her manicured fingers clawing at the lapels of his ruined tuxedo. "Richard, do something," she shrieked, her voice shrill and grating against the oppressive silence of the room. "Call the corporate attorneys, call the board of directors. We cannot let this ungrateful, spiteful girl take our home. We built this family. We built her." Beatrice stepped forward, her silver hair catching the erratic light of the police cruisers outside. "There is no board of directors left to call, Catherine," she stated with cold, piercing authority. "Sloan bought them out. There are no corporate attorneys coming to save you because their exorbitant retainer was funded by the fraudulent credit line I just terminated. You have absolutely nothing left but the pen in Sloan's hand." I withdrew a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen from the inner pocket of my tailored jacket and held it out. The polished metal gleamed in the dim light, offering a stark contrast to the utter devastation on my parents' faces. Richard looked at this pen. He looked at Beatrice, standing tall and vindicated after 15 years of forced exile. Then he looked at me. He searched my face for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of the desperate, eager-to-please daughter he had kept crushed under his thumb for 27 years. He found a stone wall. "You always were a bitter, jealous little girl." Catherine spat, her desperation morphing into a vicious, cornered rage when she realized Richard was actually considering my offer. "You were the ugly failure, the one who could never measure up to Penelope. You orchestrated this entire circus just to punish us because you know you will never be half the woman your sister is. You think stealing our money will make you respectable? You will always be a massive disappointment. Her insults, which would have crippled my self-esteem a decade ago, simply bounced off my armor. I did not flinch. I did not defend myself. I just let her pathetic, venomous words hang in the empty air, exposing exactly how powerless she had become. The grand matriarch of the Vance family was reduced to hurling playground insults from her knees on a dirty floor. "Sign the paper, Mom," I said calmly, "or I will call the lead agent back into this room and we can continue this conversation in a federal holding cell." Richard let out a broken, ragged sob. It was the horrific sound of a man watching his own execution. He reached up with a trembling hand and took the gold pen from my fingers. He leaned heavily over the small glass-topped cocktail table beside him, using it as a makeshift desk. The tip of the pen hovered over the signature line for what felt like an eternity. The ballroom was so quiet, I could hear the erratic, shallow rasp of his breathing. With a painful, defeated groan, Richard pressed the pen to the paper. His signature, normally a bold, aggressive scrawl that commanded fear and respect across the financial district, was jagged, weak, and barely legible. The agonizingly slow scratching of the nib against the heavy stock paper echoed like a ticking clock. He signed away his 49% equity. He signed away the sprawling Aspen ski lodge. He signed away the very house he was kneeling in. When he finished the final page, he dropped the pen onto the glass table. It landed with a sharp clatter. He slumped backward onto the floor, staring blankly at the crystal chandelier above, completely dead inside. I slid the document precisely 2 inches to the right, positioning it directly in front of Catherine. "Your turn," I instructed. Catherine stared at the paper as if it were coated in lethal poison. Her perfectly constructed aristocratic image was entirely ruined. Her expensive mascara had run down her cheeks in thick black chaotic streaks. Her designer silk gown was wrinkled and stained from crawling on the floor. She looked like a feral, trapped animal realizing the cage door had permanently locked shut. She snatched the pen from the table, her knuckles turning white from how hard she gripped the metal barrel. She did not cry. She did not sob like her husband. She signed her name with aggressive, angry strokes, nearly tearing right through the premium paper in her haste. When she finished, she shoved the document back toward me. She slowly raised her head, locking her bloodshot eyes onto mine. The sheer amount of pure, unadulterated venom radiating from her gaze was staggering. "You're a monster," Catherine hissed, her voice vibrating with absolute hatred. "You destroyed your own family. You sent your sister to prison. You ruined your father. You are a cold, heartless monster, Sloane, and you will die alone." I reached out and calmly took the paperwork from the table. I checked the signatures, verifying that every single line was correctly endorsed and legally binding. I slid the heavy document safely into my leather briefcase and secured the brass locks with a satisfying, definitive snap. I looked down at the woman who had birthed me, feeling absolutely nothing but sweet, absolute victory. My expression remained entirely unbothered, perfectly serene in the face of her toxic rage. "I'd rather die alone on a private island than live surrounded by parasites," I replied smoothly. "You have 72 hours to vacate my property." I turned my back on Catherine and Richard for the absolute final time. The sharp, rhythmic strike of my heels against the imported Italian marble echoed through the cavernous room like a metronome steadily counting down the final, agonizing seconds of their dynasty. I did not look back. I did not need to. The symphony of their absolute destruction provided the perfect, satisfying soundtrack for my departure. Catherine's hysterical, breathless sobbing morphed into raw, incoherent shrieking as she finally realized the terrifying permanence of her new reality. Richard remained completely frozen on his knees, a hollowed-out, pathetic shell of a man desperately trying to process the complete evaporation of his stolen empire. Federal agents swarmed past me in highly coordinated tactical formations, their dark windbreakers providing a stark, grim contrast to the ruined glamour of the ballroom. I walked through the grand foyer, gliding past the terrified, whispering gala guests. These were the high society elite, the very people who had spent decades drinking my parents' expensive champagne, validating their arrogance and enabling their toxic reign. Tonight, they were nothing more than captive witnesses to a spectacular downfall. They parted from me like the Red Sea pressing their backs against the silk-paneled walls. Their eyes were wide, filled with a potent mixture of raw terror and a sudden undeniable reverence. They knew exactly who held the power now. I placed both hands against the heavy brass handles of the massive oak front doors and pushed them open. Stepping out onto the sprawling stone portico, the chaotic, suffocating noise of my screaming family and the crackling static of police radios instantly faded behind me. The heavy doors swung shut, sealing the toxicity inside the mansion where it belonged. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. The crisp, unpolluted night air hit my face, carrying the faint scent of pine and impending rain. It tasted like absolute victory. The oppressive, suffocating atmosphere of the Vance estate, a place that had felt like a meticulously decorated prison for my entire life, no longer held any power over me. The heavy crunch of gravel signaled an arrival. A sleek, midnight black chauffeured Maybach glided smoothly out of the shadows, coming to a silent halt directly at the base of the grand stone steps. My driver stepped out immediately. His posture was impeccably straight, his expression a mask of professional discretion as he opened the rear passenger door with a respectful nod. I descended the stairs, leaving the chaotic wash of flashing red and blue emergency lights entirely behind me. I slid into the quiet, temperature-controlled sanctuary of the back seat. The heavy car door closed with a satisfying insulated thud, permanently sealing out the remnants of my past. I sank back into the plush, fragrant leather. The massive adrenaline spike that had sustained me through the evening finally gave way to a profound, unshakable serenity. A gentle vibration in my pocket broke the profound silence of the cabin. I reached in and retrieved my phone. The screen illuminated the dark, luxurious interior, displaying a single new message. It was from the person who had held my hand through every exhausting late-night strategy session, the person who had reminded me of my worth every time the ghosts of my childhood tried to drag me back down. The text from my loving, supportive partner read simply, "Is the trash taken out?" A profound, radiant warmth spread through my chest, chasing away the last lingering chill of the Vance mansion. I smiled genuinely for the first time all evening, the heavy tension completely melting from my shoulders. My thumbs flew across the digital keyboard as I typed my definitive reply, spotless. The Maybach accelerated smoothly down the winding, impeccably manicured driveway. I turned my head to look out the tinted window, watching the imposing wrought iron gates of the estate swing open to release me, then securely lock shut in my wake. The sprawling mansion shrank rapidly in the rearview mirror, its opulent exterior lighting entirely overshadowed by the relentless, frantic strobing of the law enforcement vehicles parked on the lawn. That grand house had been my personal purgatory. Now, it was their highly publicized tomb. Society teaches us a dangerous, pervasive lie from the absolute moment we are born. We are relentlessly conditioned to believe that blood dictates loyalty. We are told that family is an unbreakable bond, a sacred, undeniable covenant that requires infinite forgiveness, infinite sacrifice, and infinite suffering. But blood is merely biology. It is nothing more than a genetic accident. True family is never defined by shared DNA or a shared last name. True family is defined by mutual respect. It is built on unwavering support, absolute honesty, and the fundamental, unshakable understanding that your existence holds inherent value. Richard Catherine. Penelope and Terence demanded absolute loyalty while offering nothing but ruthless manipulation in return. They viewed my empathy as a terminal weakness. They viewed my quiet, relentless diligence as a convenient opportunity for exploitation. They genuinely believed they could continuously bleed me dry to fund their vanity and mask their incompetence. They drastically miscalculated. I did not just survive their brutal betrayal. I weaponized it. I took every cruel insult, every stolen credit, and every calculated attempt to destroy my self-worth, and I forged those moments into an undeniable, legally binding arsenal. I monetized their toxicity. I systematically dismantled their fraudulent empire piece by piece, using their own blinding arrogance as the ultimate catalyst for their spectacular downfall. I bought my freedom with the very same capital they tried to steal from me. As the Maybach merged seamlessly onto the highway, leaving the affluent toxic suburbs entirely behind, the glittering city skyline rose before me, glowing with endless unwritten possibility. I was no longer the designated scapegoat. I was no longer the ugly failure they needed me to be. I was the sole architect of my own extraordinary future. The darkness of the night felt comforting and protective wrapping around the car as we sped toward my real life, my real home, and my real family. Fade to black. The most profound lesson from Sloane's incredible journey is that shared DNA does not obligate you to endure toxic abuse. Society frequently conditions us to believe that familial bonds demand infinite sacrifice, but true family is built exclusively on mutual respect, unwavering support, and honest love. When relatives choose manipulation over compassion, walking away is not a betrayal. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. Sloane teaches us that our worth is never defined by those who try to diminish us, and we always possess the absolute power to forge our own sanctuary. Share your boundary-setting story and comment below.